I would remind you that the entire Senate leadership team has resisted Medicaid expansion. That creates some issues internally. I would say to my friends in the House of Delegates that there were 19 Republicans who supported the versions of the House budget, but there were 39 Republican members of the House and their entire leadership team, with the exception of the Speaker, have opposed it. That creates leadership issues for both the Speaker. So both the Speaker and the pretend leader of the Senate Republicans are confronted with some very challenging leadership issues that we're trying to work through, and hopefully we can bring a conclusion to the missives that are exchanged through the media.
Mr. Chairman, there's a math question here. 39 and 19 is 58 Republicans, but I don't think they are.
Maybe I'm bad on math. 31, I apologize. That's why I shouldn't be touching the budget. Today represents the first significant step forward on dealing with the biennium budget since the reconvened session. And I would suggest to you that the Senate Finance Committee and the Senate in its entirety are committed to working forward to develop and craft that budget. I would say that it is extremely important that there be an ongoing dialogue about how we will proceed forward, and that's regardless of the individual senators' perspectives on Medicaid expansion. I have publicly said, and I will say again, and I don't need any spin on it or speculation from the media, that while there are a number of us that under no circumstances will vote for Medicaid expansion, that does not mean that we are going to stand on the sidelines and abdicate the participation or suggestion of a plan that might be fiscally conservative in the best long-term interest of the Commonwealth of Virginia. That should not be a telegraphed, and do not speculate that anyone is flipping their position or weakening. It just makes a lot of sense. So I would say that it's time for the Senate and the House, regardless of our individual perspectives, to move forward with some civil discourse and try meaningfully to construct a budget that will represent the best interest of the Commonwealth of Virginia. And Mr. Chairman, those are my points, and I'm sticking to them, and I don't need anyone to interpret what my intention is.
Okay, thank you, Senator. Yes, Senator Zaslow?
Yeah, I hate to leave the topic of math, but there would have been 51%, what he's claiming, 51% of the House Republicans voted against that bill. But I remember in 2013, 40% of the Republicans, only 40% of the Republicans, which means 60%, voted against that tax increase of Bill Howe's on a final vote. But I don't remember anybody criticizing who leads what or that. You know, things happen around here. Can't give you a reasonable explanation why, but you know, sometimes you're on the right side of the numbers, sometimes you're not. When you're on the right side of the numbers, you tend not to say anything. Sometimes when you're on the wrong, you do. Senator Norman's a damn good man, but he notes right to Albert Einstein.
Okay. Just in general, I appreciate the comments that Senator Norman made, and I think the spirit today is one of cooperation. I think that's the thing that I would note. We've laid out, as we had our session, we laid out a definite time frame for coming back and working. Of course, the Finance Committee, as we begin with information this afternoon, tomorrow we're going to be rolling up our sleeves and looking at our options And even though we won't be coming back formally until the 22nd in the afternoon, I can assure you that just as there has been over the last month or so, there will continue to be dialogues which are going to make the product that we ultimately agree on a better product. I stand certainly still supporting a form of Medicaid expansion, and I'm not going to back off from that. Senator Norman and I specifically, in leading this committee, have had different ideas about how we would advance the agenda. But I can assure you, even though their conversations in public and behind the scenes have been tense at times, they're cordial. And we remain committed to developing a budget a conservative budget that will serve the interests of the Commonwealth, that will address the needs as we see them of the entire Commonwealth in a timely manner. So I concur with his overall observations about, let's not get overly excited about the fact that we're not going to do our job, because we are going to do our job. We're committed to doing it in a timely manner. And quite frankly, the movement of time forward as we've sat here, even though I would have preferred to move on a quicker timetable, has, I think, helped better educate us in a way that the product that we ultimately will report out of the Assembly and to the governor and negotiate with the governor will be a better product than it would have been had we gave in to the rush of time at the end of this past session. Senator Saslaw, obviously, his remarks, I think for the most part, were on target too. But I don't want to revisit 2013 right now, though. I want to maintain a positive atmosphere for moving forward. Yes, and at this point, I would also call your attention to our calendar for tomorrow. We're going to go through a number of things this afternoon: the revenue report from Secretary Lane, a brief review of Senate and House budget differences, an overview of Medicaid expansion in other states, where we think it's pertinent to our discussion here today, and then a quick overview that's been prepared of Senate amendments, or suggestions, as I like to refer to them, that members have put forward for us to inject into the conversation. But tomorrow morning we have scheduled a meeting at 9:30. And what Senator Norman and I have decided to do at this point in time is to re-engage the subcommittees a bit tomorrow morning. So at 9:30, rather than the full committee meeting, we're going to begin with the one where most of the focus is being thrust right now, with HHR. So same time, same place, but we will begin with the HHR subcommittee, and then we'll evaluate the need for the other subcommittees perhaps to meet briefly either before, during, or after our full deliberations of the Senate Finance Committee tomorrow, so that we can refresh ourselves specifically on where we are with our negotiations with the House, and for any new developments that may have come along that we think are pertinent to the discussion. So if everybody's clear on that, anybody else have any remarks to make for the good of the cause? All right, hearing none, Secretary Lane, we await your very positive report.
Good afternoon, Chairmans Hanger and Norman, and members of the committee. Let me also reiterate that we stand along with Governor Northam to work with you in getting a fiscally conservative budget, and I think some of the things you'll hear me say today will be along those lines. I know you've got a lot to do, so I'm going to try to go through this relatively quickly, but I'm happy to stop at any time and answer any questions of the members of the committee. What I thought we'd do is just talk a little bit about how we stand and our peers around the country, what's going on in Virginia, certainly what happened in April. But I know there's some other things that have come, and Senator Norman, I really appreciate your comments regarding in the paper and different things about where we stand with revenue, potentially going, where the rating agencies are, federal tax reform, and I hope to hit on those just quickly so we can make sure everybody's up to date on where they are. First of all, in terms of what's going on in the country, I won't go through all this, but just would note that the economic expansion continues. We're now long in the tooth. We're somewhere around 107, 108 months. That goes on another year, longest in our history. But we see some tailwinds. The federal budget that was just passed is very positive for Virginia, with the sequester being lifted. And the tax cuts, not only for Virginia, but other states are generating some economic activity. I would point out, though, that most economists are looking at a couple years out, beginning in 2020, and are looking for growth to decelerate. And a lot of that has to do with the next page, and that is what's happening with interest rates. We are seeing short-term interest rates that are moving up much quicker than long-term, a flattening of the yield curve. Usually leads to some type of economic pressures coming out. The Federal Reserve has said they're going to have at least 2 to 3 more interest rate rises this year. And if you look at Virginia specifically, our growth in the first half of 2018 was revised downward from 1.2 to 0.8%, so just barely growing. And I think you'll see we experienced that for the first quarter, although April may be something positive to come in the future. Just want to draw your attention to this map. I get a lot of questions about, well, Maryland's done this and so-and-so's done this. This is a graph of all the United States and all those states that have gotten back to pre-recession revenues. And you'll note there's 34 of them. Virginia is not quite back there yet. Now, we've been talking about this in other terms in regards to our payroll, and that's a big generator of our general fund revenues. But as you can see, we have not gotten back. We're about even. The Mid-Atlantic has been a little softer than maybe some of the other places, but I want to keep that in mind as we go through some of these discussions today, because while we do have some things in common, everything is not equal between the 50 states, particularly as it relates to tax reform, how it relates to how we may be viewed by the rating agencies. But let's get right to April revenues. Quite frankly, it was a great month. We were up almost 18%. And while the devil is in the details, that puts us at a run rate of almost double what our projection was. 3.4, we're running at 6.7% in total collections. So I would say that the chance of us ending the current fiscal year with a positive cash balance is very good. But let's talk about what makes up that. Growth in withholding tax collections. As you know, we're very dependent on personal income taxes. It represents almost 70% of our budget. The biggest part of that comes through the paychecks that are all the people that work in Virginia, the withholding. And that was a good sign in April. We returned to the pre-December trends. If you go back and look starting in December, we had some calendar things that made us go up and down. And as I mentioned, we had a little bit of issue with growth. But in December, we returned back to up to 4.4%. Which puts us on slightly above our forecast of 3.5%. So if you look simply at April, it was helped a little bit by an extra small deposit day, but we've pretty much gotten back on track. So it looks to me we're going to run slightly above our projections for this revenue source. So we're running a little bit above. And when I get to the end of this, I'm going to summarize this in a table. As you can see specifically where we are. Now, contrary to that, though, and where we really are having the large gains is in the non-withholding. And I know, like many of you, I read the Wall Street Journal, and of course, I'm sure many of you saw revenue surge boost states' coffers. So we're not alone in this. Because of tax policy changes and other things, we have seen a very significant increase in non-withholding. If you go back and look, I'll call your attention to December and January, is where we first experienced that. We were $250 million over our projections or our forecast in those months. Well, April continued that. That's a big month. In April, we're another $150 million over what we forecast, up over 23% for the same period last year. Now, that equals $400 million. And that $400 million is primarily what's driving our cash receipts ahead of our forecast in that. And to really draw it down to what is the risk in that particular issue is, as you recall, December 22nd of 2017 is when President Trump and Congress passed the jobs tax cuts. And so in response to that, we've had a lot of our individual taxpayers make substantially higher payments. In fact, went back and looked at the 781 highest income taxpayers. Those are people making over $1.7 million in taxable income. And really, we need to determine where do they stand as we look at today. And at the bottom of that, you can see that we still have 721 of these individuals have not filed a tax return in Virginia. What that means is, the way the law works is, they must have paid what they believe their tax liability to be, but their return is actually not due until November 1st. They could end up filing earlier, but they are covered until November 1st. So we have a substantial amount of these high-income payers, taxable payers, that we still don't know. All we know is they don't owe us any money. What we don't know is how much we owe them, and whether that's going to go back in a refund, if it goes back at all, because it could be for wealth generation. It could be for wealth generation. Or it could be used to offset future years' liability by putting that to future years' tax payments, which would affect our cash flows into next year. Remember, we had the same situation in 2013. In 2012, at the end of 2012, the Bush tax cuts were expiring. We had a substantial amount of people in 2013, once they got thinking that was going to happen, and in 2012, paid us a bunch of money for 2012 and 2013. We ended up budgeting off of that, and we all know what happened in 2014. We had significant budget reactions and reductions because that did not end up being sustainable. And this is the most volatile revenue source we have. It is dependent upon economic or taxable activity. And so in its wisdom, and I think the legislature did the right thing, you put in a collar. And that collar looks at a 10-year average of withholding. That's the first cut, and then it limits it to a certain percentage of other general fund revenues. So even with this high level of receipts in this revenue source, if we were to reforecast, it would not generate significant ongoing monies because of the collar impact. When you throw into that, not knowing whether or not this is going to be given back, I think we can all say that right now the prudent thing to do is to make sure we understand what happens with these monies. That is one of the reasons why Governor Northam put down, if we do have an overage this year, that any such overage would go into reserves. And I'll come talk about from the rating agency perspective, but to the extent we put it in reserves, we are not using it to fund other things like education, things that may not be ongoing. We're using revenues that are not ongoing. So that's the uncertainty that surrounds this particular non-withholding. As I said, we've looked at refunds to date. They're running slightly ahead of last year. But these big taxpayers have not filed their returns. So we won't know the whole story as to exactly where we stand for a few more months. And that'll be one of the things that we continue to monitor with these particular individuals. November 1 is the very outside date. I would suspect we would know much more before then. Many of them are waiting on K-1s and other things they need to file their returns. And quite frankly, if they're expecting a refund, I'm sure they're pushing their tax preparers to get that done as quickly as they can. So I expect to know it before then. So that's really what's driving a lot of our overage, and we still have a significant uncertainty to it. Now, sales tax, again, another good story here. It did rebound. Remember, we were running slightly behind, but we did see in April, which we hope will be a very good indicator of what's going to happen in May and June. It picked up, and we're back on target. Slightly above target on our forecast, running a couple tenths ahead of that. It looked like a lot of this was driven by home sales in terms of people shopping at Lowe's and Home Depot. Anecdotally, I'll get to the recordation taxes. They had a good month also because of home sales. So this could continue, but we really won't know until we see what happens the next couple of months. But it looks like it's heading above our trend line. Now, I mentioned this before, in front of the Supreme Court is the Wayfair case. That is about nexus or physical location for internet sales. That could be worth $280 to $300 million if that goes our way in sales tax. That's what it could be worth. Unfortunately, we won't know that until June 30th. The court has said it will report on that. If you listen to the commentary, it was hard to say whether or not the Supreme Court was leaning towards dealing with that case. The thing they most often mentioned was this should be a case of the legislature. They really were hesitant to taking action when Congress had not acted. So we'll see how that goes, but there could be a potential tailwind there for us. Now, if you look at net corporate income tax collections, this is not very significant to our bottom line. They were up slightly, but again, it looks like they're trending just a little bit above the trend line. It's not a significant revenue source for the Commonwealth. I did mention recordation tax collections did rebound, up 10%. Hopefully that'll be a good spring. I saw the article in the paper here in the Times-Dispatch about how the Richmond market was on fire in terms of that. We'll see how that all goes, but it'll really be fourth quarter determinant. But right now, they're slightly behind, obviously, the forecast. We'll see if they pick it up. Insurance premiums tax, we're not going to get this back. This was from historic tax credits filed by some insurance companies in the previous months. That money is just not going to come back in that. Now, when you add all this up, you get to the fact, again, that we're running almost double what our projection is. But again, it is primarily related to non-withholding. Now, the good news is we don't have to do very well in the next few months to make our forecast. You can see we can actually run almost 9% behind last year and still make our forecast. But again, it's all driven by that non-withholding revenue source. And a way to test this to see really how if this is reasonable, if you look at this is a summary of collections since 2000, and it's a simple measure of how much money is in the bank at that point in the fiscal year. And if you come across to April, our historical average is we put about 78.7% in the bank. We're running at 81.1. That's 2.4% increase. Every percent is worth about $190 million. Back of the envelope, that's $450 million. And that's awfully close to the $400 million that we're running ahead in regards to the non-withholding. Now, I proved this another way also. What I did was look at general fund revenues on a percentage basis, and I've also got the dollar values. On a percentage basis, how we compare. We're up $985 million as compared to last year, but we projected to be up 470 at our run rate of 3.4%. That comes back to $485 million ahead. Once you back out the non-withholding, we're running about 0.6% ahead, roughly $50, $60 million ahead of where we would be if we didn't take into account non-withholding. And I put a couple things in here. I'll point out one thing. The last deposit day in this fiscal year is worth $300 million. So the last day, if we have a hiccup, we could give some of this back. I'm not expecting a hiccup, but I just thought I'd point out that's such a significant day that if we do, that may make the difference between running slightly ahead or on forecast. Now, the key points going forward is pretty simple. I mean, we got to look and see what happens to these refunds, and we'll know exactly how much money we're going to end with going forward. Although, obviously, hopefully, we'll have a good selling season for home sales, and sales tax will continue on. This is a schedule that really summarizes where we are, and I know I've had many people question about, how does this affect next year's budget? Pulling out non-withholding, because I just don't think we have enough information, and in considering the collar, we wouldn't get a lot of money out of it anyway because of the way we do it. If you were to look at all the other reforecastable, and I call this an analysis, forecast, it looks like to me we're running about between $50 and $60 million ahead. So if we're not going to do a reforecast, don't think that's appropriate to do, but would just point out, I couldn't stand up here and not be credible and say, yes, we're running ahead on these other sources. So I do believe that there are some leeway in there. Again, I will point out that even if the non-withholding is good, it is probably one-time money in terms of how it should be viewed, at least in terms of a structurally balanced budget. So just wanted to point that out to you in terms of looking now 45 days from the end of the fiscal year where we would stand if we were to budget today in that. Now, I wanted to just quickly talk to you about the rating agencies. One of the things we did was hire an independent consultant to help us look at this, Prag. I have shared this information, in fact, part of the team, Worth the Money Committee staff. They have had this and been a part of this. This is just a quick analysis of what the scope of their work did, because I had them do this for two reasons. Not only where we are, but to the extent there was something happened that I didn't agree with, I wanted to have a third party as I disputed something that may come from a rating agency. So I'm not suggesting that this was only to show one way or the other. It was to help me to determine where we really stood. Now, this graph really is, I think, intuitive or descriptive about how we stand. If you look on the left here, now this is a graph of our AAA-rated peers, but not just those states that are rated AAA by all three. There's only 11 of us, but there are a few other states that have one or more of the rating agencies AAA, and some of those are in here. If you look at any state that has a AAA credit rating, their reserve balances are somewhere, their median is around 10.5%. The 50-state median is 8% at the end of 2017. If you look at Virginia, we are significantly below that. Not making a value judgment, just pointing out something that all the rating agencies are looking at. Now, I didn't just take Prag's work in looking at this. I also went to the National Association of Budget Directors and looked at their work. And these are the AAA rated, all three states. And as you can see, we are well behind other states that are rated AAA by all three agencies. Now, why has this become an issue? The economic term is called economic dependency. We have two things, and that's why I put that graph up to show you against other states. Virginia is very different than many of the other states for two important reasons. Number one, we are significantly dependent on federal activities. You've often heard it said we're the number one recipient of federal defense dollars. But we are also number one in federal procurement. We are number 4 in retirement benefits paid to federal workers. We are number 4 in salaries and wages paid to federal workers. So we are number 1 in total expenditures from the federal government. If you had a company and a lot of your revenues came from one company, you'd be looked at as economically dependent on that company. So that's one of the things that we're filtered with when we get to look at by these rating agencies. The other is the diversity of our income stream. As I pointed out, 88% of our revenues come from two sources. They come from the net individual income tax, and we know the volatility of that non-withholding, and sales tax, very much driven by the economy. And that leads to why we haven't pulled out, quite frankly, as quickly as some of the other states. And you combine that with looking at our cash reserves are at historic lows. I'm not saying they're right or wrong. I'm just pointing out the fact that's where they are as we look today. But it's not just outsiders and rating agencies that looked at that. In 2010, this legislature recognized that. In fact, it passed unanimously, I believe, in both houses, a referendum to increase our rainy day fund from 10% to 15%, allowed us to do that. And that was pretty much what's brought up to me many times when I talk with the rating agencies. We recognized during the Great Recession, when we had reserves of over $1 billion, that probably it may need to be more, and we passed that. But if you look at what we've done since 2010, that is not what has been the case. And this is really why the rating agencies are making this such a big deal. Because in structural balance, we're not putting in monies in reserves, building them up when revenues are increasing, and taking them down in times of uncertainty. And in fact, the single most important point that they have informed us that caused this particular downgrade in our outlook was when in this fiscal year we increased general fund revenues, yet we continued to take money out of reserves. That is what led to this particular downgrade of our outlook. I think we certainly can all agree we need to have a rational discussion on how we need to fund Virginia reserves when in fact we have the economic dependency of the federal government and a very non-diversified revenue source. And just putting it in straight terms, I put in there historic lows, this is only one of the few times in our history that we have been at this level by any measure. By any measure, that we've been in our history. So with that in mind, we did go through the recommendations with our outside consultant. I would point out that their analysis as of right now, if we do not take action, we will not continue to be rated AAA. S&P and Moody's would both assign us a downgrade based on the numbers that we know today. That's not what we're going to have, but I wanted to make sure that's where we are as we stand. Now, if you go, let me see here too, the next page, what they have said is we need to get up to around 8%. Not immediately, but that's $1.6 billion. We have the authority to go up to over $2.5 billion, but the $1.6 billion is what they would recommend. By the way, that is not the median, and that's even below the median of all 50 states. But it's where they believe, because we have some other things that offset. We have lower debt levels. We have good fiscal management. We always have a budget. And thank you, Senator Norman, for mentioning that we're going to have one, because that is key. Governance is a big issue with the rating agencies. But what they have also said is we should try to get to the 4% level as quickly as possible in that. And if you, continuing on, that they do believe we should get up to as much as 8% as quickly as possible. And if, in fact, the structural balance, one of the issues that we've talked about, is that making sure that when times of good economic activity, we're putting monies in and only pulling things out when things are bad. And I think that's one of the biggest things that they have hit on. Again, they even mentioned some things in regards to the fact of half-year raises and stuff, because from a structurally balanced position, that doesn't show you can pay from them long term. I will point out they also mentioned, and get off of this, is that if we do this, they believe this cloud will be lifted from us. So if you go back and to summarize, if you look at the introduced budget, and I know that's not where we are, this was the introduced budget of Governor McAuliffe and now Northam, that budget would have gotten us up to 3.3%, which is the next lowest state, Missouri, that is AAA rated. So I would at least have something to push, we'd have something to push back on. But of course, if we do put additional monies from an overage this year into reserves, then quite frankly, we'll exceed that point. So that's the facts that I know them and what I have communicated in terms of reserves. Now, a quick update on federal income tax reform. Again, in the Wall Street Journal, they ran a story on what you should know about tax reform. It was 8 full pages. This is a very complicated process. It is not like what happened in '86, where we just increased standard deductions and standard and tax brackets. This is itemized deductions, net income losses, has to do with pass-through entities. Anybody that's dealt with this knows that that is a fairly significant undertaking. But let me just put off right up front, if Virginia does nothing, it is worth hundreds of millions of dollars to us. Hundreds of millions of dollars. $300 to $500 million if we don't conform or we choose to conform at today's standards. Now, one of the things that I'm often asked is, what does that do to individual taxpayers? So instead of doing back of the envelope stuff, what we have done is been working with, and I want to get this right, it's Chainbridge, not Cambridge, not the ones at the federal level. It's Chainbridge Analytics. This was the gentleman that did the analysis in '86 for the Federal Office of Management and Budget in terms of looking at the changes at the federal level. By the way, that took them 3 years. But nonetheless, we have hired them, and what they're doing is actually constructing a model. And the model is taking actual individual tax returns from 2015 in Virginia, overlaying it with the federal return, and we chose 2015. That's the only year we have a complete set of federal and state tax returns. Overlaying that, so if you ask me what the impact of doing X is, I will be able to tell you not only in general, but also in terms of specifics, maybe by as down to the zip code level, if we want to get to that level. It is not a forecasting model where we say, for instance, the average deduction in the Commonwealth of Virginia, not including state taxes, is $30,000. Well, if you solve for that, then you would have the issue of having the median is only $15.8 thousand. So if you solve for the average, you're going to do a lot of different things to other people that you didn't anticipate. So just to sum, we expect this model to be done at the end of June or so. It is made up of two models, one for the individuals, which, as we know now, expires in the year 2024, and that's the majority of the monies that I talked about, were the individual level, about 2/3. The business is permanent. That will be done going in there. And what we're doing is, I know the governor will be reaching out to work with the money committees on putting together, however you want to approach this, a committee to look at various alternatives. Let me end with this. This is a table by level of income. And this is how you get in trouble if you do back of the envelope. Now, under the new law and at the federal level, if you're a married individual, you get $24,000 standard deduction. In the Commonwealth of Virginia, it is now only $6,000. You would think if you were making less than $25,000, it's a no-brainer for you to take the standard deduction. But if you made that assumption, you would disenfranchise quite a few Virginians. Because even at the level under $25,000, many of our people have deductions over that amount. I'm researching as to find out why, but that is what the tax returns are telling us. Conversely, if you look over $500,000, you would expect everybody to itemize. Yet, we have quite a few Virginians that take the standard deduction. That I do know. That's called trust babies. A lot of people that don't have earned income. But the fact is, without looking at the details, it'd be difficult for me to stand up here and credibly tell you what these changes are. So that's where we are with the tax, whether we call it reform or adjustment, and that's where we are with revenues. And Mr. Chairman, that completes my report.
Senator Norman?
Good afternoon, Mr. Secretary. I've known you for many years. I didn't know when you worked with the former chairman, Senator Stosh, but he said you were an extraordinary accountant, and I don't think anyone has ever disputed that, and certainly knew you when you were down there with Great Atlantic trying to keep a challenging boss straight, and your tenure over there at Achievable Dream, and I'm not a numbers guy. On the revenue situation, before we get there, I would say that there are a few of us up here who were around and participated actively in the creation of what we affectionately refer to as a rainy day fund. And that was a very conscious awareness of trying to maintain a structural balance that both Senator Stosh, I think Governor Warner was a very vocal advocate of it. Doesn't mean others weren't, but they certainly drew it to the forefront. And so I would say that I think whether it's been Democrats or Republicans that have been in charge of Senate Finance and the money committees, there's been a genuine sensitivity to a structural balance in moving forward in a deliberate way. I don't see that changing now. Second point, you talk about the dependency of Virginia's revenues. That dependency hadn't changed in decades.
That's correct.
That is not a new phenomenon. We have worked through that in robust times. We've worked through it in recession times. We worked through it in sequestration. That's not a new phenomenon. So I put it in the context, that's not something we're unaccustomed to dealing with and being sensitive to. You know, on the revenues, it's interesting to me, you stood before us in January and said sometime in May we ought to have an idea where revenues are. Sometime in May we ought to have an idea preliminarily where the tax reform is. And so I say something publicly about it, and all of a sudden I'm clamoring for a reforecast, how it's been morphed into that. I don't understand why we would have wanted to move forward on a budget where potentially there's $450 or $460 million in unanticipated revenues. I don't understand that, And frankly, I take great satisfaction in sitting here today, reading what I've seen in the last couple of days. The issue is that if in fact we have those unanticipated revenues, what do we do with them? I can't imagine that there's any of the 16 members sitting up here on this committee that have an appetite to take that money, which you said, may be one time, certainly not predictable on a reoccurring sustaining source, why we would want to embed that in a reoccurring cost. I think that is a fiction. So I think if you look and see what we have done historically with the Revenue Stabilization Fund, the creation of this cash reserve fund, that both the House and Senate are very sensitive to what we do with revenues and trying to maintain and attain an appropriate level of cash reserves. So whether it's 450 or 460 or whatever it is, as long as we responsibly appropriate it so it's not in a recurring cost, that ought to enhance our movement towards that 8%. Won't get us to 8, but it ought to constructively move us in that regard. So when I see 8 out of 10 months, according to your graphs, that there's been a growth in general fund revenue, when I see 7 out of 10 months where there's been an increase in withholding, I understand it. But there are things that we can do that the collar will not constrain us if we put the money in an appropriate place. So I would say to you, Mr. Secretary, I think that we are going to move forward in a very, very responsible manner, and I hope that you will take comfort in that. But I also appreciate that you work for the administration and you do a wonderful job for them. But that's why we have the separation of powers that constitutes a balance, and we in the legislature, at the end of the day, will do what we think is appropriate and can have that discussion with the governor. But there's some posturing going on all three sides, and I respect that. It is interesting to me on the bond rating situation, and I thank you for not introducing the discussion of Medicaid expansion on how it can potentially affect the bond rating. Some have done that, and frankly, I consider that an absolute Trojan horse. So I thank you for not emphasizing that today. We are very sensitive to the bond rating on it, and we have been hearing how we are being watched. I am awful on numbers, but I have had the experience of going to Wall Street on 1 or 2 occasions with some governors and listening to the financial analysts in those areas of sensitivity that they're watching Virginia on, and how in those confidential conversations, how we measure up. So I would say to you, Mr. Secretary, I appreciate very much what you have shared with us. I hope you will convey to the administration that the Senate Finance Committee is prepared to move forward very deliberately, very fiscally responsible, to try to address the concerns that Wall Street may have in the Wall Street Journal or in a fictional situation. But we are very sensitive to that, and I appreciate your cautious approach on it. I just happen to be, by definition, not as effusive in my optimism as a former governor, but I'm based in reality, and I remain optimistic of where we're going. And I think we will, on a bipartisan basis and collaboratively, move forward in a fiscally responsible manner that will give Virginians comfort.
Yes, sir. Just, if I may comment, if it's all right, sir. I actually had the same conversation with the governor as I had, and I think you'll ask your money committee staff. I probably has been as collaborative working with them as anyone. I think, quite frankly, when we get down to it, we may have different opinions as how they ought to be used, but where they are and where we stand ought not be a topic of either political or different. Now, you're right. In May, I think I recall I said beginning in May we'd start to understand, and we have begun to understand. If I were to sit up here today, I'd say we're going to keep more of it. but I can't tell you we're going to keep all of it in going forward. The only thing I would point out, Senator, in regards to your remarks is everything's true except for the low level of reserves. We have not been this low with this type of outlook, and that's really why, and I have taken a conservative approach. I fully admit. I told the governor I would give him information the way I'd run my own business, and this would cause me significant caution in my business. If you look, it was an article, and I've asked Mr. Farrell if I could do this in public. He said I could. Dominion Resources had a similar situation where their mainstream, one of their pipeline subsidiaries, had a negative outlook. They immediately went and raised capital to get rid of that negative outlook. We can't raise capital. All we can do is put money in reserves. And so that's the approach that I have taken in here. And finally, Mr. Chairman, I've written an op-ed on where I stand on Medicaid expansion, but I have not said that it has anything to do with our AAA credit rating. I've only said that I believe it would free up monies so that it could be used. That may be you may have a different opinion of that, but I fully understand. In fact, if you look at those 34 states, 20 have taken Medicaid expansion and 14 haven't that have recovered. So I'm not linking those directly in that regard, but I do believe that would free up monies. But again, Senator, I appreciate your comments, and I will pass this on to the administration.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Yes, Senator Carrico.
Just real quick, in the House version of the budget, the provider assessment, knowing that what you're talking about, structural balance, happen to be based upon revenues, knowing that this provider assessment on hospitals is only good for this budget because it was in the budget and not in a bill, and has the potential of expiring in 2020, how can those dollars be used as determining structural balance when you look at AAA bond ratings?
I have two ways. Number one, putting them in reserves. Quite frankly, whether it's a reserve for the entire budget or whether it's a reserve for Medicaid expansion. If you look at some of the other states, they have reserves for that particularly. Money is fungible. If you do that, you free up other types of monies in that, Senator Carrico. So you would take those monies and put them in those covering things like reserves, debt pay down, things that are not recurring to free up in other monies. And I think if you look at the budget, there's ways to do that.
Just to follow up, how much would that equate to as far as if the provider assessment wasn't there and you were trying to base that number on a tax increase, sales tax or income tax bump? How much would that equate to?
If I'm understand the question, it's about $300 million is the provider assessment.
That's what it's estimated to, 300 million?
Yes, about 300 million, yes, sir, about 300 million. So that would be like the windfall from Wayfair. It would be, a small percentage of sales tax, but it would be an increase.
What, a penny?
Sir, I don't know. Do any of you guys know what's that would be, $300 million? I don't know. With $300 million, what type of increase in sales tax, Craig, do you have off the top of your head? So less than a penny? Yeah, less than a penny, about a third, maybe half a penny. Yes, sir. Sorry, I didn't have it off the top of my head, but that's it.
Okay, Senator Carrico, is that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Yes,
Chairman.
Senator McDougall?
Secretary Layton, so
Yes.
the target number that we're shooting for on the cash reserves is around 10%. 8% would get us in the ballpark, but 10% should be our target. Is that what I understood?
Yeah, I would say if we got to 8%, $1.6 billion,
Okay.
that I would now, and because I want to point out, this is not the only measure. We get great measure. One of the things that we pointed out, we bought down some long-term debt instead of putting it in reserves. We should get credit for that. We have very good governance. We've been having this AAA rating for 80 years. I mean, it's 1930s, in that regard. The problem we have is giving them a conversation. And I think, so if we get up to 8% with our others, I think our scores, I can only predict, I think we'd have a great case of saying we have done what is effectively prudent to do based on Virginia's situation.
Okay. Other members? Yes, Senator Barker?
Quick question, well, actually two questions for you. One is on sales tax revenue, which are up this year.
They are slightly ahead, 3.2 versus.
Right. But even the 3.0 that was forecast on that is significantly higher than generally what we've been achieving the last few years. Have we do you feel that we have turned the corner on sales tax revenues and we'll now go back to a more normal growth rate pattern there, or are we still, do we still have significant risks related to
We have some
some
trends
of
that
our
are.
own challenges as well as the federal situation and the internet sales, those types of things that have led us to be close to zero in the past?
We still have some headwinds in that regard, I believe. Number one is internet sales. Quite frankly, as the percentage of the economy, retail sales go away from bricks and mortar, that continues. It keeps going up. So even if we might have an increase in general activity, we've got that counterbalancing us. If the Wayfair comes through, that'll be a part to us. The other thing that's happening is structurally, more services are happening in Virginia versus production or people buying things. Obviously, we don't tax services. One of the things I looked at in comparing us to other states is that we are heavily dependent on these. The next state is about 50%. Many of them tax things we don't. I'm not suggesting we do that. Please don't quote me as that. But I'm pointing out that we have some headwinds with sales tax. It's sort of like the gasoline tax. There's some things moving away in the economy that's making that less of a dependent revenue source. But certainly an increase in general activity, retail sales pickup, we're going to get our share of that.
All right, and one other question, Mr. Chair. The other issue, it seems to me, is the drawdowns that are made on the rainy day fund. I actually was a Senate patron of that constitutional amendment that took us from 10% to 15% on the max, and instead we've gone lower, not higher, even though in general our revenues have been decent to fairly good. A couple of years, 2014 was obviously a challenging year, but other than that, we've actually been a fairly good position. And part of what has been, I think, a little disconcerting to me has been that in some years, we have had a projection of what our growth was going to be. By the end of the year, we exceeded that, but yet at some point during the year, we took money out of the rainy day fund. And it seems to me that when we have that dynamic there, that there needs to be some corrective action taken so we don't get down to the 1% type of thing where we are now.
That is a big part of what they'll talk about as structural balance, and that is when revenues are increasing, that we are putting monies in, and that we're only taking them out when, in fact, we have a decline in general fund revenues. In fact, again, as I mentioned before, the point that really got them sort of over the hump in terms of S&P was the fact that in this fiscal year, our general fund revenues were going up, yet we were still taking monies out of reserves. And that's why I think we need to have this conversation. And look, I get it, that pressures are, people are paying taxes, we want to spend the money, put it in services, governors are that way. I understand that, I really appreciate Senator Norman's comments and how to balance that. But we're going to have to realize that, look, if we had another economic downturn now, where would we go? We'd have to cut services. We don't have the reserves to lean back on. And that's really where I think we need to have some practicality in putting an amount into reserves all the time and then pulling it out, maybe not when we need it, in bigger chunks. In other words, to show more of a systematic way of putting it in and taking it out. I mean, I think it'd just be a better way to manage not only the state, but any business also.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think this is something we need to try to address during the coming fiscal year here. So,
Mr. Chairman. Yes, Senator Wagner. Yeah, just a question on the Supreme Court cases before them right now in terms of internet sales tax collections.
Yes.
Is everything in place right now? If the Supreme Court was to rule that we could collect those taxes, is everything in place on the books now to start collecting those taxes?
We would, Craig, we would probably have to make some adjustments, but
I think it depends on the specifics of their ruling. They were asked to opine on South Dakota's economic nexus law, and to the extent they determined that law is either constitutional or unconstitutional, but particularly if it was constitutional, we may have to take some steps to have legislation that would somehow mirror what they put in their ruling.
Okay, and Mr. Chairman, if I could, I asked that in context of the trigger on the fuels tax.
Yes,
and it very much concerns me that is over our head right now.
You're right, Senator Wagner. If, in fact, the Supreme Court rules, the trigger would not be met in our legislation. So it would not go into transportation. However, if Congress were to pass a law, in other words, the Supreme Court ruled and then Congress passed the law, then that would trigger our revenues going into transportation.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Senator Wagner, I thank you for the question, because I'll pose a question to you, Mr. Secretary, and you might have had a different answer last year when you were wearing a different hat. But I'm inclined to preemptively take action in terms of that we have a budget in front of us, where I'm inclined for us to think about a notwithstanding clause which would address that. Because I met with members of the Judiciary staff in Congress about 3 weeks ago. I think you're right, as you referenced, the Supreme Court will rule, or if they don't, I think the Congress will be directed, and I think they will act affirmatively. And certainly, from my standpoint, it would be inappropriate for us at this point in time, as people are transitioning to internet sales more, for us to take sales tax dollars that have been going to support teachers and police officers and put it into asphalt pavement. So I hope you would agree with that.
Well, I don't have an official, position from the governor. I would say this is my former hat. I never advocated for an increase in taxes, and I don't mean that to say I don't agree with them, but because I thought it was important to use everything we had as efficiently as possible first. However, I will say this: we did take action in previous legislation to offset some of that, and I've forgotten the name of the actual legislation. But remember, we moved $40 million out and put it into transit. And so I would just ask you to look at, if you do the notwithstanding, I may agree with you, this is not the policy of the governor, because I haven't asked him, but I would look at, there was some adjustment made, and make sure that's accounted for when you put that notwithstanding language in there.
All right, thank you. Other questions? Thank you, Mr. Secretary. You've been very helpful today.
Yes, thank you very much. I appreciate being in front of you.
I think we're all pleased of the performance of the economy over the past couple of months.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, staff is going to give us, I think, at least a brief overview of some of the basic differences between the House and Senate budget.
Thank you,
We don't want to get
Mr.
into too much
Chairman.
detail. We'll be here till supper time.
No, we'll try to move through very quickly. And just to remind everybody, this is the HB 5001, which would have been 29, and 5002, which would have been 30, against the previously passed Senate versions of those bills. So that's what we're discussing, the differences between the two. Just quickly, as you know, the House came back and passed a bill on the 13th, the committee in the 13th, and then the full House on the 17th. There are a couple of changes, so I just want to emphasize that. There's a provision that disenrolls individuals who do not meet the work requirements under their expansion language. So if they don't meet the work requirements for 3 months out of the year, then they cannot re-enroll until the next plan year. There's also language for the Secretary of Health and Human Resources to develop and apply for a Section 1332 waiver to stabilize the individual insurance market. That's something that a number of the members of the Senate have been interested in. And then finally, there's some incorporation of some revenue reserve amendments that had been offered by the governor. And essentially what this does is dedicate 100% instead of 50% of the remaining surplus after mandatory deposits at the end of this fiscal year, and also includes provisions from the revenue cash reserve bill that passed as well. And they eliminate the contingent employee bonus that would have been funded from those year-end surpluses. Those sort of go hand in hand. Moving on, just as a reminder, common House budget themes or features: Medicaid transformation. They amended through the state plan, but wanted to implement with a waiver if it was approved. There was a provider assessment of about $307 million. There was in a second year across the board and some targeted compensation actions. Their revenue reserve total at the end of the biennium appropriated total would have been about $247 million. And then lastly, we just want to mention there was a big higher education research initiative called CyberX, which essentially in Northern Virginia, with Virginia Tech being the hub and other institutions being sort of off of that as spokes. Senate priorities. We maintained a strong cash bonus. Our revenue reserve balance was $336 million appropriated by the end of the biennium. And then we fully funded the Medicaid forecast. Another priority was to preserve funding for the SOQ re-benchmarking, improving community-based services for the mentally ill, maintaining as much of the higher ed operating and financial aid funding, the new funding that was included in the introduced budget, and then making prudent investments to maintain the Commonwealth's future economic growth as best positioned. I'm going to turn it over to Jason to cover just briefly some top-level items.
You'll recall that back in March when we left, the primary net difference that we're getting to here, this is general fund spending, is around $847 million. That is comprised in absolute value variance of our spending in HHR to offset the provider assessment revenues that were in the budget as introduced, cuts that we took in K-12, cuts that we took in central accounts, including the compensation actions, our reductions in higher ed of $32 million, the steeper reduction on the House budget for the Secretary of Finance represents a lower level of deposit to the Revenue Cash Reserve Fund. We took less in cash savings out of the capital outlay program from cash for capital outlay. We spent more in public safety. This was, again, offsetting some costs that were funded in the introduced budget based on the provider assessment. We had to take cuts against the commerce and trade in that area. Most of the new House spending is in the Economic Development Partnership and Go Virginia areas. When you turn to the legislative branch, we had a slightly higher level of spending there. The bulk of that reflected the Senate's proposal to replace the aging LIS system, which was not funded in the House budget. We had cuts, again, in administration compared to some additional spending they had. We were within $2 million in judicial. Natural resources, we both took similar levels of reductions, slightly different approach to executive agencies, reflecting savings from cabinet secretaries, eliminations, and not doing some proposed salary increases for the cabinet secretaries. Similar reductions in ag and forestry. We were also small differences in veterans, independent, and technology when controlling for the movement of the VITA and CIT to two different secretariats. Had a small delta there. Again, that was reflecting just some position savings. So that net difference that you're trying to bridge as you compromise the two budgets with all fund sources, it's $3 billion is the all fund sources, and general funds, it's $843.6 million is the variance of that delta. When you looked at the revenue resources, I won't dwell too long on these. You can see that we were in the same general ballpark on revenue resources. There were some additional transfers that the House had that we did not have. Same case is in the biennial budget as well. So April is going to talk a little bit on the bond rating.
Just because we got a number of questions, we provided this for informational purposes only, but this is just straight from the Virginia Performs, and it just gives you a little bit of what even our own state web pages say. But Virginia's AAA bond rating is just a reflection of the confidence that's placed in the Commonwealth's fiscal health. I won't spend a lot of time there. Depending on the source, you get 12 to 14 other states, depending on whether they're counting those that don't have debt. And that includes peer states like Maryland, North Carolina, and Tennessee. And if you've got a AAA, that means all three bond ratings have given you that rating. And this was just for informational purposes. Again, we specifically were asked which states had expanded, not expanded, and then how that compared to the AAA states. As you can see, and Aubrey mentioned this as well, 32 states in the District of Columbia have opted for expansion. That includes 4 of the AAA states. However, 18 have not, and of those, 8 AAA states have not expanded under the ACA. And again, that's for informational purposes. And no, the colors don't have any meaning. It just happens to be that the blue and red are in the template. Otherwise, we'd have to have more colors. So just so you know before I get that question. Moving on, we'll turn it over to Mike.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For some reason, I'm letting HHR go first. So I'm just going to cover the very high-level differences in health and human resources. Mainly, there are over 150 amendments. It's typical. There are a lot of amendments in HHR, so I'm going to keep it at a high level and just talk about some of the key differences. This chart basically just gives you the overall summary. The one thing I'll just note is the difference between the House and Senate budgets is about $294 million over the biennium. That is primarily because in the Senate budget, we had to restore the actual savings that were assumed for Medicaid expansion, because the Senate budget doesn't include it. So that is the primary driver of the differences, but there are a few other differences in the details. So of course, as you all know, that the main difference is that the House budget included an expansion of Medicaid. This chart just gives you the summary of the governor, the House, and the Senate. You actually see it, it's in the next presentation of Medicaid too, but I'll actually describe it here since we're talking about differences. Essentially, what you have is the governor's introduced budget expanded Medicaid through the traditional way, which is the state plan. Every state is governed by a state plan. It represents the traditional Medicaid program. The House basically actually does allow expansion to the state plan as well, but the only difference being that they do require application of an actual waiver to kind of implement some of their provisions like the work requirement. So they both the House and the governor's budget covered the $300,000 that were assumed to enroll. They both have about $307 million in cost over the biennium, and both would be paid by a provider assessment on hospitals. The governor's budget did not include any type of work requirement, and the House budget did. And lastly, they both actually included language that would technically disenroll the expansion population if federal funding were reduced for it. So I did include what the Senate had included. As you all recall, the Senate did put a proposal forward that was trying to address some of the most vulnerable individuals, essentially those, everyone with a mental illness, with substance use disorder, as well as looking at people with chronic life-threatening conditions, and also looking at the priority one wait list for the developmental disability waivers and to eliminate those. So the Senate's plan, as you all know, was technically aspirational because at the end of the day, we did not have the resource to actually fund it. But the Senate still laid out the plan that as we go forward, this is the intention of what they would like to see funded when money is available. What it would essentially touch was to amend the existing gap waiver that we already have. We already have a Medicaid waiver. We would expand that to include those populations. It would have been capped at 20,000 individuals. Also would have covered over 2,300 people in the waivers. The estimated cost, about $273 million. This, of course, at a 50% federal match, of course, is much more expensive than the 90-10 that you actually would receive through the expansion population. Of course, the Senate is just expanding what we already have, so there's no work requirement. And lastly, of course, there's no necessary to have any language related to federal reduction in funding. So I'll just very quickly go through the House Medicaid expansion provisions. These would take effect if the waiver were approved. So essentially, the only thing that the language required was that they actually apply for it. So then there would be a period of time before the negotiations are complete with CMS that you could then get approval. So they do have some provisions that would say under the state plan where you can actually engage people in work or community engagement to the degree that you could do that, as well as other personal responsibility provisions, which are more limited in the state plan, but there are some things that you can do that those would go ahead and be implemented until the waiver is approved and would take effect. It also included provisions looking at those people above 100% of poverty with income that basically you would actually pay premium assistance for them to purchase insurance through the exchange, as well as any individuals below 100% of poverty, of course, would be enrolled in their Medicaid managed care plans. The next thing I'll talk about is their Training, Education, Employment Opportunity Program, TEOP. This is what they named their kind of the work requirement, or they like to call it community engagement from a broader perspective. Essentially what it does is it would require that all able-bodied adults on Medicaid would actually have to participate in work as the work is defined here. Certainly there are exceptions to that. The exceptions aren't listed here, but they include things like the blind and disabled, as well as people who are institutionalized, medically frail, with people with serious mental illness, pregnant women, and former foster care children. So you have certain exceptions and generally what exceptions are focused on is kind of more populations that where work and community engagement is certainly a more difficult thing for them to achieve. So then the question is, how do you define work? And that's actually I did not advance it, sorry about that. Basically, it lists the requirements. So work includes everything from job search, education, general education, or unemployment-related, vocational, community work experience, and volunteering, as well as caregiving services for a non-dependent relative who has a chronic disabling condition. And as April already mentioned in HB 5002, and actually one as well, the House did add the provision that has a lockout period, so that if you don't meet the requirements for 3 months out of the year, then you'd be locked out until the next plan year. They also include a requirement to waive the provisions in high unemployment areas of the Commonwealth, as well as talking about utilizing Virginia workforce centers and one-stops to help provide services, and then, of course, utilizing whatever federal funding sources are available to help fund some aspects of the work program. I won't go over this map just because I'm going to talk about it in the next presentation to you, but it just basically summarizes those 8 states that have expanded through an alternative Medicaid expansion, which is essentially a waiver. So the difference between the House and Senate budgets. So here I'm summarizing everything in community behavioral health. And the one focus that I'm going to give you is kind of the bottom line, is at the end of the day, what the Senate budget did is it wasn't that much different than the introduced budget. It's both around $54 million. So essentially, there were a few things that the Senate budget cut out, and certainly there were some concerns about that. But those were focused, if you look at the lines, like addressing state hospital capacity. And mainly that's because the Senate took a different route to do that, as opposed to what the governor's budget had proposed, which was basically to transfer some of these individuals to assisted living facilities. There was some concern that transferring them from one institution to a smaller institution was not the ideal thing to do. As you all know, the Senate Finance Committee certainly has prioritized permanent supportive housing and other community-based housing options as far more important than alternatives like assisted living facilities. So essentially, that funding was redirected to other things. And you can see on there are things like the alternative transportation plan for TDOs, so you don't have to transport people through sheriffs. There's also discharge planning at local jails to help give jails the capacity to connect those individuals to services. There's a telemental health pilot program for the southwestern region of the state. And then there's additional grants for what they call Intercept 2. That's when they first come to their initial court appearance, to give resources there to divert people to appropriate care as opposed to continuing through the criminal justice system. And then, of course, expanded funding for CIT training. These were all recommendations of the Joint Subcommittee for the Mental Health in the 21st Century. So essentially, what the Senate was doing was just redirecting to its own priorities. Next, behavioral health facility spending. Again, there's not much difference here. The only change that we actually made here was we actually reduced the cost for hepatitis C treatment at the Virginia Center for Behavioral Rehabilitation to reflect the fact that some of the newer hepatitis C drugs are cheaper than the older ones. On the DOJ settlement agreement spending, I'll highlight there was only one difference here. The Senate budget adopted everything except for it did cut about $1 million out of the state rental assistance program for independent living, but you can still see that they left $3.6 million left to help promote those options for people with developmental disabilities. Major HHR savings. Here you'll find that there are only a few differences. Both the House and Senate, of course, adopted. This is when Congress suspended the ACA insurance tax, so that savings was adopted. The Senate budget did include a proposal to cap rates for private day special education services while we're actually continuing to study those services and what's the best way to proceed. The House budget actually did include, they took 50% of the hospital inflation in FY19 as a savings. Both sides actually eliminated the overtime and the 2% rate increase for consumer-directed attendance. The Senate budget actually included a little bit of savings due to expected increases in tobacco taxes for the healthcare fund, as well as they took out funding for a call center contract, basically through exploration of merging call centers at DSS and the Department of Medical Assistance Services. And lastly, both the House and Senate budgets had taken out the first-year funding to implement electronic health records with local health departments. And then, of course, major budget language differences. There's always a lot of policy and language in the Senate budget. So as I touch base, I already mentioned kind of the strategies to control CSA expenditures. Was the Senate imposed in a cap of 2% on those rates, at least for these 2 years. The Senate also had language related to addressing some of the pressure in state hospitals, which was basically through developing a proposal to incentivize private hospitals to take more temporary detention orders. Lastly, there was a proposal related to hospital participation to serve Medicaid recipients and managed care. And the last one I would note is just that there was also Senate language to impose a one-year moratorium in freestanding emergency departments to provide time to consider whether or not the certificate of public need process should apply to those types of facilities. The last thing I just touched base on here is stabilizing the individual insurance market. As April mentioned, the House did actually include language. So this is right now proposed on the House side, which is directing the Secretary of Health and Human Resources to develop and apply for state innovation waiver. So this is a Section 1332 waiver. It's part of the Affordable Care Act. And it's supposed to explore different solutions, such as a reinsurance program or a high-risk pool, to help stabilize the individual marketplace. Of course, the Secretary would be required to report back to the General Assembly, and the waiver would not be implemented until the General Assembly actually appropriated money for the funding for the state share of it. So unless there are any questions, I will turn it over to April for higher education.
Okay, thank you, Mike.
Moving quickly, Mr. Chairman, there is, just as a reminder, the Senate trimmed some of that new funding that was in the introduced budget, about $32 million. And for that, still left new money of about $212 million over the biennium. In the House budget, they actually went above the introduced budget by about $74 million for a total of $318. And if you remember kind of that chart that Jason was showing you initially, sort of the delta between the House and the Senate, that's where you get the $106 million right there. And just so you know, in the base, or what probably normally would be base, is there was research money of $16 million in both budgets under the Research Investment Committee. What was different in the House budget was that $40 million I mentioned for the CyberX initiative, and then there was an additional $4 million for focused ultrasound research at the University of Virginia. Sort of a high level to get you to this 106 between House and Senate. If you look at that bottom line, 178 to 72, these are sort of the initiatives. You might remember an undergraduate need-based aid, the Senate trimmed 50% of the new amount in the introduced budget. You shaved off the first-year funding of some of that base adequacy or base operations funding for a number of the institutions. There was a reduction from the introduced on the technology infrastructure of about 25%, a number of things in and out. The Workforce Credential Grant Program needed new funding. That remained the same as the introduced. And I will mention under NSU, there was a cybersecurity and cyberpsychology program that we felt would be better funded under a research grant, and that explains that. And then a number of ins and outs under other. Otherwise, if there are no questions, that completes higher education. I'll turn it over to Sarah. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Turning to K through 12 education. Slide 30 is a summary of direct aid to localities for public education. And looking at just the dollars in the third line down that says net change proposed in the introduced budget and focusing on FY 2019 and 20, the $206.5 million and $309.4 reflected a total increase of $515.9 million in the introduced budget over the FY 18 base when a rebenchmarking year. And then just focusing then on the adjustments in the House and Senate budgets at the bottom of the chart. As you can see, the House bills increased in FY 19, $29.1 million and $54.5 the second year, whereas the Senate was offsetting reductions compared to the increases in the introduced budget. So the House went up a little over $80 million and the Senate went down about $80 million from the introduced budget for a difference across the 2 years of about $170.5 million in direct aid. On a per pupil basis, it's not on this chart, but the difference in the first year between the House and Senate budgets is about $34 per pupil in the first year and just over $100 per pupil in the second year. On slide 31, you can see some of the larger differences. The first line shows that both budgets did fully fund the rebenchmarking amounts of $481 million. The second row and the fourth row is where you see the bulk of the differences in the dollars. The second row reflects the compensation actions. The introduced budget had funding for a second year, December 1st, 2% compensation increase. The House budget added funding to that to begin it at the beginning of the second year, whereas the Senate reversed that action. So there's a almost $88 million difference on that one action. The fourth row is the lottery per pupil amount. This was a signature item on the House budget to get the flexible per pupil lottery amount up to 40%, and that brings it from up to $237 million with the addition of this 91 over the 2 years through a combination of redirecting the no-loss funding, some additional lottery forecast dollars, and adding general fund dollars to get to that piece. Back up the row before that, the Senate did maintain $7.1 million proposed in the introduced budget to increase the at-risk add-on amount. Both took a different approach to no-loss funding than the introduced budget, which reflected both enrollment loss and composite index, slightly different approaches and dollars on enrollment loss funding. And both reversed the proposal to fund the state's share of a full-time principal in those very small elementary schools. And the Senate maintained the funding for governor's schools funding policy so as not to have a reduction for FY19 compared to the FY18 approach. And there are some smaller dollar items at the bottom of that page. On slide 32, both had similar approaches to the technical updates and adjustments to the lottery proceeds forecast in the biennial budget. The Senate had a few reductions that the House did not. Those are removing the local school board member costs from the SOQ. That's $5 million across the 2 years. Also, $4.5 million to update the school breakfast reimbursement incentive base year. So there is still an increase, but that is a lower increase than the introduced budget. And continuing the phased elimination of project graduation in this biennial budget. On the next page, you see that the House has just a few spending items on these smaller items. They had focused primarily on those two key signature items. The two smaller House items on this page are at the bottom, going down their chart. It's about $800,000 for vision screening and an additional $500,000 over the 2 years for a YMCA summer academy. On the Senate side, there's some additional funding for teacher residency models that have been supported in past years, additional funding for career and technical education centers, particular innovation school, as well as a high school apprenticeship program in Richmond City, and some STEM teacher recruitment incentives and some smaller items. Slide 34, both budgets had several actions related to early childhood, many of which stemmed from a December report from JLARC on early childhood, as well as work of the Joint Legislative Subcommittee on Virginia Preschool Initiative since 2015. Both maintained funding proposed in the introduced budget for kindergarten readiness post-kindergarten assessment. The House also added funding for a kindergarten readiness to go statewide by next year. And they also had some funding for the Department of Education to develop a specific plan for increasing high quality, including every class to be assessed or observed every 2 years, evidence-based curriculum, and professional development. Under classroom observations, both budgets had similar items there. And the big dollar difference you'll see in the fifth row, the Senate added $4.6 million per year by increasing the per pupil amount for the Virginia Preschool Initiative from $6,125 to $6,500, although targeting the increase for curriculum and professional development, similar to the next row where the House had funding for professional development as well. And there were several language items on both sides that I will not detail at this time. Under the Department of Education central office, you see, looking at the House column, similar theme as before. There were a few of the proposed increases that were approved in the House budget, whereas the Senate maintained funding to automate the teacher licensure process from a paper-based system, and also maintained the $1 million to align the Office of Student Services funding. Both, going towards the bottom of the pages, both removed a proposed increase for environmental education and a new advisory council. On the next page, the Senate also had some new funding related to social studies assessment and dyslexia training, and there were several language amendments, including the Senate's items at the bottom of the page for a new legislative ongoing commission on elementary and secondary education, and also language related to developing a plan related to small school divisions. That completes K through 12 education. Turning just very briefly to other education, there were a few differences in the other education agencies. The Senate did include some additional funding for library aid statewide, whereas the House maintained the higher funding specifically for the Eastern Shore Library construction. And the Senate maintained some amount of the new funding proposed for Commission for the Arts, whereas the House had an item related to Gunston Hall. This next page just shows the same actions on both budgets related to other education. And a brief summary on retirement actions. Both budgets did fully fund the VRS board-approved rates, and the only issue related to retirement between the two budgets relates to higher education. Both had similar language directing the development of a methodology related to university personnel that used to be classified positions. And then in addition, the Senate took the next step and goes ahead and directs the VRS to make the changes to the contribution rate based on this information in order to recover stranded liabilities related to the change in classification. And that completes my portions of the presentation.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Caitlin?
Good afternoon. For the Department of Corrections, the net difference between the House and Senate was about 28.3 million, and the main driver is due to the proposed Medicaid, the proposed reduction that was associated with Medicaid expansion in the introduced budget. The House partially restored it, but maintained the majority of the reduction, and the Senate fully restored the reduction. For inmate medical costs, the introduced budget included an additional 38.3 million in general funds that was primarily associated with increasing inpatient and outpatient costs, and the House did not amend this item, and the Senate budget reduced it by 6 million based on our proposal to require providers to accept the Medicaid rates for inpatients. Moving on, for the Department of State Police, both the House and Senate budgets maintain proposed funding for a new special operations team, and a portion of the introduced funding for replacement of 2 helicopters, and the proposed funding to continue operating support for Comlink, which is the Commonwealth link to interoperable communication systems. The House budget maintained the proposals for additional fusion center analysts and polygraph quality control analysts, and both budgets had language in Part 3 related to electronic summons fees. The Senate version allows state police to collect a non-general fund revenue associated with summonses written by state agencies, and the House budget included 1.9 million of general fund to support an electronic summons pilot in Division 7. For the Alcoholic Beverage Control Authority, the House and Senate differed on funding for the point-of-sale systems and the proposed new positions. For the point-of-sale system, the Senate budget included a partial reduction to remove a contingency and a portion of the budget that was included for depreciation. The reduction primarily impacts the second year, and it is our understanding that the funding level will allow full implementation of the new system. And our amendments also fully fund positions and overhead costs for opening 8 new stores per year, but eliminated additional management positions that were sought for existing stores. We also provided funding for conversion of 25 part-time positions to full-time. And accordingly, our amendments increased the transfers to the general fund by 5.9 million for a total of 231.2 million over the biennium. Quickly, for other public safety, the Secretary of Public Safety in the introduced budget had proposed $1 million from the general fund to update the Commonwealth Interoperability Plan and to assess and upgrade State Police's Comlink system, the Commonwealth Link to Interoperable Communications. The House maintained a portion of the funding to hire a contractor to complete the study, and the Senate budget maintained the reporting language but did not provide funds to hire the contractor. Both budgets maintained funding for 8 additional scientists and equipment at the Department of Forensic Science to address case backlogs. For VDEM, the introduced budget included 3.1 million for a new training program for first responders, a grant coordinator position, and emergency vehicles. The House maintained 1.1 million. They shaved a portion of the training funding off, and the Senate version did not include additional funds for VDEM. And then just skipping to DCJS, the key differences were in HB 599 funding for localities with police departments. The Senate budget fully funded the first year amount of the introduced budget, but continued with flat funding in the second year for a total of 13.2 million. in additional funding for local police departments. And the other main difference is that the House version eliminated second-year funding of $2.5 million for mental health, for a mental health pilot program in jails that was created in 2016, based on the final report being due in fiscal year 2019. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, and I'll quickly cover veterans and
Okay,
defense.
Caitlin, on that point, sometime over the next couple of days, if you could get us an update report on the mental health and jail pilot programs,
Okay.
I think that's going to be important to our conversation moving forward on Medicaid.
Okay. What? Yes, in Veterans and Defense Affairs, the major difference is personnel, and the Senate did not fund an additional increase for the Office of the Secretary that was included in the introduced budget. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, the biggest differences between the House and Senate budgets in Commerce and Trade relates to Go Virginia. You'll recall that the Senate budget maintained funding for the Growth and Opportunity Fund at $24.5 million each year. That's level funded, whereas the House increased funding by $15 million over the biennium, $5 million in the first year, $10 million in the second. Also, the Senate budget does reverse a proposed increase of $637,000 general fund each year for administration, but instead authorizes the board to reallocate some of the funding from the fund, the Growth and Opportunity Fund, for that purpose if it feels that that's necessary. Also, in the House budget, the House does set up a new Interns for Virginia program using funding from the Growth and Opportunity Fund, and also requires that the board and the Secretary of Commerce convene a work group to provide guidance on statewide broadband policies. Moving along just quickly, there are two slides here with that outlines additional differences between the House and Senate budget. I'm going to draw your attention to just about 4 items of the most significance. The second line here shows a transfer, $21.1 million. That's transferring the CIT to Commerce and Trade. While the Senate budget does not include those specific amendments, this committee has expressed an interest in that concept. Moving down to the Virginia Grocery Investment Fund toward the bottom of the page there, the introduced budget includes $7.5 million for this initiative. This, you'll remember, is intended to address food deserts. The House budget included 0, whereas the Senate budget did include $2.5 million for that purpose. And on the last line, in the area of broadband funding, the Senate budget does include significant monies for this purpose. The introduced budget did increase funding by $2 million. The House accepted that position. The Senate, on the other hand, increased an additional $4 million for broadband deployment. This next slide does outline a few smaller differences between the two budgets. In the interest of time, I won't go over these, but we'll address questions if there are any. Otherwise, I will just sum up by saying that the difference between the House and Senate budget, if you go to the bottom line there, excluding those transfers that I mentioned, is about $15.8 million.
Okay. Thank you, Joe.
Mr. Chairman, turning to agriculture and forestry, very small differences of less than $1 million between the two chambers' positions in ag and forestry, primarily around positions and small grant funds. In natural resources, as I noted in the overview, we were very similar in our cuts to the natural resources programs, which were in effect offsetting reductions from settlement cash that several of the agencies that are funded with general funds had received. Primarily, we make some reductions to the Outdoors Foundation, the Virginia Land Conservation Fund. The House did have a couple of smaller spending items that we did not have. We were the same on WQIF, and the House had increased its transfers from the Department of Game and Inland Fisheries by $1.6 million to fund a new dredging fund that passed the General Assembly this past session. With respect to natural resources capital outlay, both budgets had reversed the Alexandria combined sewer overflow, and the Senate had put the $20 million in VPBA bond authorization in for $20 million for the stormwater local assistance fund. Otherwise, we were all consistent with the introduced budget in the infrastructure packages. We had funded SAVE for $4 million worth of park cabin infrastructure that the Senate did not fund. Turning to transportation, another major difference area. When we last left, that was the doubling of the vehicle title fee from $10 to $20, which generated about $52 million in non-general funds over the biennium. That is included in the House budget. The Senate actions generate about $1.1 million in non-general funds, primarily from vital records fees and some cash at the Department of Corrections to reimburse for credentials that are issued through the DOC to offenders as they are integrating back into society. We were both the same on Real ID compliance, slightly different, but very much in a collaborative position. And we both authorized DMV to investigate privatization of adult driver's tests, including language allowing sharing of gas tax information with the two regional transportation authorities. In mass transit, not much to talk about here. We both rejected the bond issuance. The Senator Saslaw's, Mr. Delegate Hugo's bill passed, so most of the budget language that was included in the House mass transit programs has already been adopted as statute. At VDOT, the House had a series of VDOT language amendments that did things such as expanding the prohibition on project labor agreements to P3s, which are currently exempt in the code, reviewing I-81 project prioritization, that's consistent with Senator Obenshain's bill, directing VDOT to reevaluate the tolling algorithm used on I-66, and authorizing VDOT to impose reverse commuter tolls on I-66 inside the Beltway. There was also language directing Virginia Beach to use $3 million in their local maintenance funds for construction of a sound wall that they had applied to VDOT for construction of. The Senate language, similar small set of amendments, $1.5 million for matching Army Corps of Engineer funding for Chincoteague Island, correcting some interpretations of statutory amendments made to Arlington Henrico, again, small dollar figure, directing a review of costs and financing for special and unique structures. Those include big bridges and tunnels that would not necessarily score high in smart scale or state of good repair programs, a couple of other small policy issues. The next major difference is the authorization for the Port Authority to dredge the Hampton Roads Harbor improvements. Both bodies contain $20 million in Commonwealth transportation funds for preliminary engineering work. However, the House did authorize $330 million in additional general fund supported bonds for the full funding of the Port Harbor widening and deepening program. We both rejected the proposal to add $2 million general funds to the Economic Development Zone grant program. Turning to the capital projects at the port, as I mentioned, the main difference there is $330 million for harbor widening. We were the same for APM terminal equipment, for cargo handling equipment, Portsmouth project, and the Virginia International Gateway terminal lease, as well as maintenance reserve. If there are no questions on transportation, that brings up Adam.
Okay. Thank you, Jason.
And very quickly with technology, my fault, but not a lot of difference there. And we all, we had agreed in concept before we left to move the technology agencies into the Secretariat of Administration, into the Commerce and Trade Secretariat. And we were the same on IT disentanglement by increasing the letter of credit authorized to VDOT.
Very good. Okay, Adam, good afternoon.
All right, afternoon. Thank you, sir. So moving to employee compensation, the governor's budget included a second-year, partial year, 2% raise for all employee groups that would be effective December 1st of 2019. The Senate budget included language directing the governor to include in his next budget funding to offset any potential shortfall in revenues at an amount sufficient to provide a 2% raise for all employee groups, and that would be a full-year raise effective July 1 of 2019. The House included full-year funding for a 2% raise for all employee groups effective July 1 of 2019 as well. And then there are about $22 million worth of targeted salary initiatives for a variety of employee groups. So moving into the legislative agencies, the Senate included funding for sexual harassment training. Both budgets, the House and Senate, included funding for General Assembly operations, which will reflect the move to Pocahontas and transparency initiatives. The House included funding for the Henrietta Lacks Commission. Both budgets included funding for Capitol Square security enhancements. The House was a little bit higher for a full-time public information officer position. The Senate included funding for the bill tracking system replacement and DLAS, and both budgets included funding for JLARC for the rent increase, and as well as the House included language amendments for a prepaid 529 program review, as well as a review of the investment benchmarks for the college savings plan. So moving into judicial, the Senate scaled back the funding for the drug court, additional drug court dockets by about $600,000, providing $200,000 over the biennium, as well as scaling back a little bit on the mental health dockets by about $500,000 relative to the House budget. The Senate did provide about $500,000 each year for additional criminal fund fee cap waivers for court-appointed counsel. The Senate budget included $200,000 for some circuit courts IT systems changes to comply with SB 1044 of the 2017 session. And looking at judicial positions, the Senate budget included the $288,000, which would reflect one circuit court judgeship. And the House budget included funding for a total of 20 judgeships, which would reflect 4 above the current 16 vacant but funded positions throughout the circuit court, general district court, and JDR courts. Going into administration, the Senate budget had funding for a chief data officer position in the Secretary of Administration. The House had a variety of amendments to reflect the proposed abolishment of the Department of Small Business and Supplier Diversity and the elimination of the Technology Secretariat, respectively. In the Comp Board, there were some amendments for the in the Senate budget for the Savin system enhancements. $200,000 for additional assistant Commonwealth's attorneys to prosecute insurance fraud. And the Senate budget had a language amendment for body-worn cameras that would require localities to provide one assistant Commonwealth's attorney for every 50 body cameras deployed at the local level. And the Senate budget also provided $500,000 to offset the Circuit Court Technology Trust Fund supplant. Quickly going on with administration, both the House and Senate budgets provided funding for the Phase 2 site assessment for the CVTC. The Senate budget provided about $570,000 in general fund support, while the House provided a mix of NGF, non-general fund operating, and capital funding. The House had funding for O&M for the Carillon. There was language in the House for a pilot program to monitor contractor productivity. Moving to elections, the Senate budget reduced funding by $200,000 for a voter call center, as well as scaling back the Help America Vote Act grant general fund backfill by about $3.5 million each year. And moving into finance, the Senate budget removed funding related to additional base operating funding for the Secretary of Finance. Looking at the revenue cash reserve, you can see the amounts of the governor's introduced budget at about $271 million. House provided $91 million over the biennium, as well as $180 million for the Senate over the biennium, and that doesn't include the FY18 amount of $156.4 million that would be in addition to that. And that's also not inclusive, obviously, of any surplus revenues that might go in FY18 year's end. In the Department of Taxation, there were a number of amendments. The Senate budget had a language amendment that would convene a work group to examine the accelerated sales tax, including the potential phase-out of the AST by 2022. There were a number of initiatives in the Department of Taxation, including in the House adding 4 more auditors to the 8 that were in the introduced budget that would generate an additional $4 million in general fund revenue. In the Department of Treasury, there was no funding for the relief for Robert Paul Davis, given that there was no Senate bill, and there were differences in the calculation for the Norfolk 4, but the conference committee amounts reflect the House amounts of $600,000 and $3.5 million, respectively, and both budgets included funding the state share of 25% of the Henry County Jail project, which was approved. And that completes the general government area, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Okay. Thank you, Adam.
Good, sure.
All right, April, I guess you got capital left here, it looks
This is
like.
the last slide of this presentation, so I'll move very, very quickly. Just high level, you're going to want to look at VPBA, VCBA bonds, the differences between the three. That's the debt that most counts against the Commonwealth. 9C, 9D really includes more of the revenue streams from higher education, typically parking, dining, et cetera. So you can see there's substantial differences between the introduced, the House, and the Senate, with the House having the most at close to $1 billion there. The biggest difference, Jason's already mentioned, that port project, there's planning in the Senate. The House provides the full amount at $350 million. The next biggest sticking point that hadn't been resolved is that the Senate provided funding for 2 juvenile justice facilities, one at Isle of Wight and one at Bon Air, whereas the House did one very large facility at Beaumont. And if there are no questions, that concludes this presentation.
Okay. Senator Norman.
Mr. Chairman, I was reflecting back on some of the comments that Secretary Lane made, and it dawned on me in the depths of my ignorance, which no basement, it occurred to me, can anyone tell me the approximate difference in basis points or whatever is quantifiable between a AAA and a AA bond rating?
I have it, if you give me a second. It's not large, but. It's not very large, it's a few basis points, but with the Prague analysis that they did, what they assumed is if one rating agency downgraded us, that the annual debt service cost would change by an average of about $34,000 over the life of 20 years, which is about $700,000. If you look at all the outstanding debt, obviously that goes up to whether it's 1 or 2 or 3 rating agencies, it moves up to about anywhere from 34 to about 73 million over the life of all the outstanding debt currently.
34, I'm sorry, Mr.
34 million to about 73 million if we were downgraded by all 3 rating agencies. And that would be on all of our outstanding but unissued debt, which was about 643 million in general obligation bonds and 4.2 billion for the remaining appropriation credits.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay.
That turns us over to Mike for the next presentation, I believe.
Okay. Are there no additional questions then on that overview? Okay. All right, Mike.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So what you have before you is just a presentation. This presentation is intended to be informational. Basically kind of, I'll say it's a refresher on the issue that continues to be debated in the budget. So what I'm going to actually try to do is kind of talk about an overview of Medicaid, sort of as well as expansion in other states, and then kind of cap off just a little bit about the individual health insurance market, which has been of interest to the Senate. And so, of course, when I talk about Medicaid and the overview of it, I'm kind of talking about in the context of sort of the state budget. And if you remember at last year's annual meeting in November, I spent a lot of time speaking to you all about Medicaid and how the budget driver has grown over time within the state budget. So like I said, I'll just do a brief overview of Medicaid expansion. I'll talk about the status in other states, the financial impact of the overall Medicaid program, along with the estimates of expansion for Virginia. I'll talk about alternative expansion options that have been approved in other states, as well as a brief summary about the provider assessment. And of course, like I said, I'll talk a little bit about the individual health insurance market at the end. So talking about just Medicaid expansion overview. So as you all know, the Affordable Care Act provides coverage. It was passed in 2009. In 2012, of course, the Supreme Court made it optional for states to expand, that a state could not be compelled to expand coverage. So that's when it became optional. So what the ACA was trying to do was to cover all individuals between the age of 18 and 64 with incomes up to 138% of poverty. So if you're a single individual, you're in the $16,000 range. So, and these would be people who are not currently eligible for Medicaid. So it essentially would expand Medicaid to become a program for all lower-income individuals. It's kind of a misnomer. Oftentimes, people have talked about Medicaid is for the poor, for lower-income individuals, and that's not traditionally true. It's actually tied to certain groups. Groups that were traditionally considered vulnerable, like the aged, blind, and disabled, and eventually it was expanded, of course, to pregnant women and children as well. So a large portion of the population that you're expanding to, it is to some of those other populations, but it's largely to childless adults. And then I would just cap, as you all know, we talk about the 90-10 funding a lot. So essentially, we're well past the first 3 years of the Affordable Care Act, which paid for the expansion cost at 100%. We're currently in 2018, where the federal share is 94%. In 2019, it'll fall to 93%, and then it will reach 90% in calendar year 2020, and then beyond. So in talking about the groups eligible for Medicaid, so what this chart is actually showing you, the light blue bars, those are the current eligibility groups. So it's everything, the one all the way on the left are basically elderly and disabled individuals that receive long-term care services. So that one kind of goes higher than most because it's kind of tied to supplemental security income payments. Then pregnant women and children, children being the largest group covered by Virginia Medicaid. And then you'll see the groups to the right, kind of where you see the light orange. Those are the kind of the groups that would be included in Medicaid expansion. So when you look at 138% threshold, so you actually have, I did include here the seriously mentally ill. So about 4 years ago, we created the gap waiver to cover the seriously mentally ill. It was kind of done in lieu of any expansion at the time. It's a more limited benefit because it doesn't cover hospital services. So essentially, those are just adults that would all be covered up to 138% with the full Medicaid benefit within expansion. Then there's the elderly and disabled group that you see that goes up to 80%. Currently, that's the group that does not require long-term care services. So they have a lower income eligibility, but you would pick up some individuals there. Then you can see the only non-disabled individuals that we currently cover are parents, and you see that gets up to just around the 50% of income of poverty level. And then lastly, you'll see the orange column all the way on the right. That's childless adults, though, unless they have some type of disability or whatever, they would not qualify for existing Medicaid.
Okay.
So now,
Senator Norman has a question.
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm still going through an ongoing tutorial on this. Describe that last group to me, childless adults who are currently not eligible for benefits under current Medicaid. Describe that group to me. I get childless and adults, but is that it?
They are just low-income individuals. They have no disability. They have no serious mental illness under Virginia, the way Virginia does it. It's just a low-income individual without a child that under traditional Medicaid, that population was never covered. It was always intended, Medicaid was created as a safety net program to help those people considered most vulnerable, but certainly it has evolved over time.
Mr. Chairman, so would they have to fall within that criteria of 18 to 64 and 138%?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Norman, correct.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, Mr. Chairman, because they are a childless adult, help me understand why that's a qualifying criteria.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Norman, under current Virginia Medicaid, it's not. What the Affordable Care Act was attempting to do was to create more of a national health insurance program. With the federal subsidies on the exchange covering people above 138%, and then the gap below that in Medicaid, they were trying to cover all individuals up to at least 400% of poverty in some type of health insurance.
It's everybody else.
Mr. Chairman, I mean, Senator
else.
Newman, who frequently throws me a life preserver when he knows I'm under the waterline, says, that covers everybody else.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Norman, that is correct. At that income, below that income level.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman.
Okay, Senator Stewart.
Senator Norman's wisdom has inspired questions in me, if I might, Mr. Chair.
All right, go right ahead.
Mike, so if I understand correctly, the groups in that orange those are the people who would now be qualified if they adopt Medicaid expansion.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Stewart, that is correct.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Stewart?
I've heard numbers from 300,000 to 400,000 Virginians who would be eligible for this. Do you know what the number is? And can you tell me how we do know what a number is? What the definitive evidence is that there is a number of people who are eligible?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Stewart, it's a little bit harder question, but I'll do my best here. So certainly, 400,000 has been around for quite a number of years now. I always look at it as a rounded number. Technically, the estimate, I think, was developed based on looking at the numbers from from census statistics that show the number of uninsured in Virginia and their income levels, and saying that, this number of people up to almost 400,000 are uninsured. And in theory, at that income level, should be eligible for Medicaid. The 300,000, there's a number, 300,000 is what is actually assumed in the estimates would actually enroll in Medicaid. So even in the current Medicaid program, we have people who are eligible but not enrolled. It's not an uncommon thing in public assistance programs that people, they don't know they're eligible, or for some other reason they don't want to enroll, so they don't assume that they will all enroll. Certainly other states' experiences, have resulted in a lot more people being enrolled than they expected. Other states, their estimates were sometimes closer. It's really hard to say because you do have an element of the population that's even currently eligible but not enrolled, and you start to pick those people up too. So it's hard, but it's probably based upon the information that's available to us today. It's probably, it is a decent number, but it could be very different at the end of the day.
Mr. Chairman. Can I continue, Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
And I'm sorry,
Sure.
it seems to me that Medicaid expansion is impending, and I'm trying to learn everything I can about it while I'm here. So is that a guess, Mike? Best we have to figure, and I'm just trying to learn, so I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but does that devolve to really being an educated guess?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Stewart, it is based on analysis. Like I said, they've started with the uninsured numbers. They've made certain assumptions. So, it's a fairly well-educated guess. I can't, you can certainly disagree with the assumptions. There are certainly some in there that I might make a different assumption if it was my estimate. But these are the estimates that come from DMAS, and they're at least, they are based on analysis that is a decent educated guess.
Okay. Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Senator Stewart.
All right, so based on the fact that this is an educated guess, and is the plan to enact an open-ended entitlement program, or is there some mechanism to cap the amount of enrollees in this program? Because otherwise, I don't know how you budget for it. Is that a good question? Is there anything in this designed to cap the amount of people that can enroll? Because as I understand it, there's this $400 million bed tax that's supposed to pay Virginia's share. What if more than 300,000 enroll? What if it's 600,000? So have we taken any steps to cap it so that we know the amount of the tax that they're enacting will pay for the program that they're going to open?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Stewart, well, in regards to the number, there is a kind of an absolute higher number because, and I don't have them right with me, but I think in the last estimates that the total number of uninsured people in Virginia was somewhere in the 700,000 to 800,000 range. I forget exactly what it was. And some of those people were at a higher income level, so they would not qualify under a Medicaid expansion scenario anyway. So could it be higher than the 300,000 they project to enroll? Certainly. Would it be more than 400,000? It's hard to say. Now, when you talk about a cap, even those other states, and we'll talk about this shortly too, that have waivers to kind of change Medicaid to be different than it traditionally has. I think one aspect of what they're trying to do is contain the cost of expanding the program, because it still remains an entitlement program that if you do it, they are entitled to the benefits as has been approved and negotiated between the state and the federal government. So
we're not limiting it to any amount of enrollees. It's just if you qualify, you can get it. We got to figure out how to pay for it.
Correct.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Senator Stewart?
And again, Mike, I apologize. I really am trying to learn everything I can about this, and Senator Norman made me get on, and Senator Hanger made me get on HHR subcommittee, so I figure I better learn everything I can learn about it. So I know that there's a threshold between if you're a single individual or if you're married and have one or two children, and that scale goes from maybe 16,000 to 28,000. Is there a mechanism to determine today who's eligible versus next year who may try to be eligible because maybe they're making more money today and they're not eligible, but next year they're not? And I wouldn't want to suggest that people may intentionally make less money to take advantage of this. But to avoid that scenario, is there any mechanism in there so that we don't suddenly have this vast numbers of people who decide they're not going to make as much money as they once did in order to take advantage of this program? I don't know any other way to ask it.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Stewart, what I would say is I think if you specifically, you'd probably have to look, I think other states are trying to address that in their own way. Certainly, I think that's where the idea of the work requirement comes in, so that we don't create a program that disincentivizes work. That's certainly I think the perspective that they're trying to, that they kind of have. But there's other provisions like, that you could probably look at, like within the context of a waiver, where you might be able to address some of that so that people just don't come in and out for different reasons. But it certainly that can be looked at, but yes, it is somewhat of a challenge because, if at the end of the day they meet the criteria, you can't say no.
So, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Stewart?
So, I guess what I would say is, I'll ask Mike this question. When I first came to the Senate, I followed a guy named John Chichester, who was Senate Finance Chairman, and one of the things he told me when I was coming in is you can't budget an unknown. And he said, anytime you want to give people breaks or, taxes, you got to have a pot of money. You got to know how much money that is, and that's the only way you can budget. And I'm looking for Mike's help here. It seems to me there are a lot of variables. There are a lot of things we don't know. How do we budget for a program like this?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Stewart, as we go through the presentation, I think we might touch on that a little bit more. There's a slide that kind of talks about cost controls in Medicaid, looking at what some of the other states have done. It is always going to be a challenge because it essentially is an entitlement program. But I do believe that there are ways that other states and Virginia can look at how do you create a framework to look at that and to address those costs as they occur over time. So, and I'm not even talking about not just in the expansion population, but even Medicaid itself.
Okay, thank you, Mike.
Okay, Senator Wagner, and then Senator Newman.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, we have that same problem right now with the existing Medicaid program in terms of trying to budget it based on how many people are eligible. And I think it's becoming an increasing concern as I don't get older, but a lot of other people seem to be getting older and doing that. But help me with this question. If I'm currently under the poverty level and I get in an automobile accident, where do I go out? Obviously I go to the hospital, right? Who pays those bills now?
So, Mr. Chairman, Senator Wagner, so I'm assuming you're uninsured
Right. I'm uninsured and I'm under the poverty level,
Um,
under 138% of poverty.
Most like, well, it depends, Mr. Chairman, Senator Wagner. I mean, it depends also who's at
I
fault.
mean, it's going on every day right now.
Correct.
Right.
It depends on who's at fault. So if you're not at fault, or you're at fault, I mean, at the end of the day, it's going to be indigent. If you can't pay the bill at the hospital, it'll just be charged up to indigent care.
And if I'm really, really ill and have a bad thing, where do I go if I don't have this? Do I go to the emergency room?
Yes.
Okay. And who picks up that bill?
I mean, typically, the hospitals do it through the indigent care that they provide. And now, what I would say, though, is, I mean, certainly, if the scenario works its way out, you know, if you end up being qualified as a disability, then you could be put on Medicaid. So, I mean, it just depends on the circumstances.
Well, I understand, and these are all leading questions, you might imagine, as were Senator Norman's, if I caught it properly. And not being an attorney, I'm not as skilled as Senator Stewart and Senator Norman are in asking leading questions. But it's fun to be in your job, I understand, and you have to answer these leading questions. But I think we all understand that it's going on right now, that the folks in this level are getting medical care, maybe not as good as they should be, and maybe not even getting any lessons in perhaps how to live healthier lifestyles. But we know it's going on now. We know it's going on, and we know that those costs are being incurred and those costs are being laid on the rest of us. And is one, and I will mention just one reason why healthcare premiums go up and that kind of thing. But there's a whole lot of other reasons that need to be explored in later sessions, but I just thought I'd make that comment.
Okay. Senator Newman?
Briefly, Mike, this is hopefully not leading, but going to Senator Stewart's question, is that I understand that there is a term out there called woodwork. In other words, those people that come out of the woodwork you didn't anticipate. It might be helpful for all of us, including Senator Stewart, to have a list of if 25,000 and 50,000, 100,000 more than we anticipate coming out, what's the cost of that? Because that's how we potentially end up down here in September, is if we have people coming out of the woodwork. So it might be helpful if we were to get the cost of those, if we have 25,000 or 50,000, 100,000 out of the woodwork.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Newman, yeah, that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair.
All right. Yeah, Senator Carrico?
When we look at some of the things in the House plan, how they structured theirs towards the way that Kentucky has with the work plan and so forth, and you look at Kentucky that came in 08 and how much theirs has increased, it's obvious that what they had initially begun as far as Medicaid expansion has grown tremendously. So based on what Senator Newman said and based on what Senator Wagner has said, has there been research? Because I've asked the question many times. Is there a reduction in the number of emergency room visits after Medicaid expansion has been done in that state? No one can answer that question, and I don't know if that research has ever been done.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Carrico, you know, there's a ton of research in the world of healthcare. You know, oftentimes when you expand, you know, I think in some states they have had the experience that you expand Medicaid, you have a lot of individuals that actually have issues that need to be resolved. And unfortunately, oftentimes I think when they get that coverage, they believe that the emergency room is the best place to go to start getting that care. So it probably depends on the individual experience of the state. There was, I think it was back in about 2008, there was what they call the Oregon Health Experience. So this is before the Affordable Care Act. Oregon actually was expanding their Medicaid program, but they ended up doing it by lottery so that they only had so many slots. And fortunately, at the time, there were researchers who actually watched that, and that's why they call it the Oregon Health Experiment, to see what transpired. And they did see that, of course, once you initially do it, you see this uptick in emergency room visits. It doesn't mean it's sustained. It may eventually abate as they, you know, if they have a chronic condition, or, you know, they start to get regular care. But yes, it's a difficult thing to answer, but yes, there has been, you can see an uptick in and ER visits.
Okay, all right, yes. Senator Fastball?
Yeah, one of the things that hasn't been brought up here that's been experienced in a lot of other states is that there's been a shift of people from the 50-50 Medicaid to the 90-10, which makes it cheaper for the state. Now, Senator Stewart, and he's not here, remarked that there would be some people who might think that, well, I'll earn less so I can get a government benefit. I've been around a while, a long time, and a real long time. I have never met anybody in my life, ever, who said, geez, if I could only make less, I'll get a government benefit. That isn't how the human mind works. Most people that I've ever run into, experienced, or heard about have always said, I want to make as much as I can, as quick as I can.
I don't think you need to answer that
Chairman,
one. That's that statement.
Mr.
All right.
Chairman, I'm assuming that's not a leading question.
All right, actually, I'm
Mr. Chairman,
Senator Stewart, you have, I guess.
I would just suggest that Senator Fairfax, Senator Sessler needs to leave Fairfax more often.
You telling me that's what your constituents do?
Okay.
Your constituents are bleeding the state?
All right, I think we're going to have to refocus here.
You need to ride around with law enforcement for a while.
I'm glad that we're having the broader conversation because I think we are going to do something. We want to do something that's reasonable. I would only add before, Mike, as you continue, and we'll try to keep you on task here, is that I wouldn't call it an educated guess. There is a rationale with the number. There's a finite number of people out there. We are aware of human behavior, and so there is some unpredictability, and people's circumstances change. But we can be more precise about that, and I think we can be comfortable with our exposure because the points that were being made by a couple of the members, Senator Wagner specifically, we are already shouldering. Taxpayers, hospitals, the individuals themselves are shouldering that cost just in an ineffective system. And I think whatever we pass, it will be incumbent upon us to with the appropriate follow-up and protocols to make sure it works. Otherwise, it'll be a failure. I'll agree with that. It will be a failure unless we commit ourselves, whatever we pass, to following up, monitoring it adequately, making sure that we're doing what we intended to do. So,
Mr. Chairman, can I?
Yes, Senator McDougall.
Mike, had some conversations with members from Kentucky, and they indicated when Medicaid expansion was enacted by their governor some years ago, they had an influx of individuals into the state from surrounding states, I think particularly to their south, that had not expanded Medicaid. Could you try to find us any information on how much they missed their estimates and whether that trend is actually did occur as those legislators believed it did? And get back to us with that.
Sure. Mr. Chairman, Senator McDougall, I would just add that I don't know about the influx of people from other states, but I do know that Kentucky, of course, I don't know who did their estimates. They probably got another job by now. But I think their initial estimate was somewhere in the range, and I'll get the exact numbers for you, like 150 or 200, and it ended up being over 500,000. Now, Kentucky is very different than Virginia. It has a poverty level of 30% of the entire state is in poverty. So that's why I don't know who did the initial estimate, but certainly I can get those exact estimates and see what happened in Kentucky.
Okay. All right, Mike, we'll try to let you breeze on through. We've got a few members, I think, that aren't on the Finance Committee. We want to get to their proposed amendments if they want to hang around, so we'll move on through here. You've got a lot of good information here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just an update, I'm moving to slide 6 of 25. So, but all very good questions. So this, actually, I won't go over this map. This is just for your information. It was actually in the other presentation as well. It just gives you the status of the expansion states versus the non-expansion states. Maine was the last state to technically move to the expansion category, although they haven't technically expanded yet. It was done by a voter referendum to approve it, but the governor of Maine refuses to expand, and now the citizens and other people are taking him to court. So it's in the hands of the courts in Maine, but technically the voters have approved expansion there. So I'll talk a little bit about the financial impact. So if you remember back to this slide, Medicaid versus general fund growth rate. So if you remember back to the annual meeting back in November last year, I talked a lot about how Medicaid is grown as a budget driver. This slide is actually just a good illustration of kind of the counter-cyclical nature of Medicaid. So if you think after the Great Recession of 2008, you can actually see in the red line is the Medicaid growth rate versus the general fund growth rate. So of course, Medicaid spending is going to basically skyrocket after, especially a recession of that depth. As people lose their jobs and eventually exhaust their resources, they ultimately will qualify. They could qualify for Medicaid, and so you see that enrollment spike and the cost as well. And of course, it's spiking at the same time the general fund revenues are declining. So of course, it becomes a very big issue for the state. But you can also see in the years once Medicaid came back down from 2011 to 2013 that they pretty much grew together. Of course, over the past few years, general fund revenues have been more down and jumping around, and Medicaid's probably averaged higher than that. Now, of course, if you look back over the decades, Medicaid on average grows faster, so that's the main reason why you see it as it's grown as a share of the budget. So what I did, because oftentimes I get this question, when you look at Medicaid as that budget driver for the state, this chart is basically just taking, for some reason it doesn't show on the screen, the percentages at the bottom. So it must be a slight technical thing. But essentially what happens is if you basically look at the past 5 years, the average annual growth for general fund revenue as well as Medicaid, it actually grows from about 22%, which is what it is in about FY19, to 28% if you carry that out. Now, certainly, that's a 3% differential between Medicaid growth and general fund growth. You know, general fund growth is improving, so if that gap closes, of course, this will be different over time. But this is just kind of an illustration. Like I said, it's just reflective of Medicaid, the overall program as a budget driver. This has nothing to do with expansion. Expansion is really just another additional amount that technically would be added to this if it actually occurred. However, of course, if you expanded Medicaid through a provider assessment, it really has no impact on this if the provider assessment pays the full cost of expansion. In the next slide, this is just a summary. I won't go into great detail that talks about these are kind of the expansion costs and savings that were built into the introduced budget. You can see primarily the costs stem from the coverage of the newly eligible adults, as well as there's a small amount of money related to the woodwork effect. Senator Newman referenced, that's those people who are currently eligible but not enrolled in Medicaid, and then the administrative costs. And that's where you get to the $80 million in FY19 and the $226 million in FY20 makes up the $307 million that's frequently talked about related to the cost of Medicaid, and as well as the amount that the provider assessment would pay over the biennium to cover those costs. And then on the bottom part, you know, your most significant savings is indigent care, state-funded behavioral health services, the inpatient hospital costs for state prisoners at the Department of Corrections, as well as there's other kind of substitutions of state-funded coverage for newly eligible people. There's a whole variety of programs that technically would shift to the 90-10 funding in the Medicaid expansion environment. And that gets you to your total savings of about $421 million over the biennium. So I did, this question is looking at the idea of, these are the 4-year estimates. When the Department of Medical Assistance Services did their estimates for Medicaid expansion, they actually did it through 2022. So what this is just actually showing you are those costs, which is the blue line, versus the light green line, which is the savings over that 4-year period. Now, as you see, of course, the gap closes when you get to FY 2021, because that is the first full true year of expansion at 90-10 funding. So you kind of have two things that happen. When you first expand, there's always a lag, because you're not going to enroll hundreds of thousands of people in day one instantly, and before their healthcare costs start to incur. But you also have the fact that it's not till 2021 that you have a full fiscal year of 90% federal funding and 10% state funding. So your costs kind of go up a little bit in 2021. But it still actually shows that from an ongoing perspective is that the savings from Medicaid expansion pretty much does continue to exceed the costs, albeit it's smaller. And that does actually continue through the next biennium. So the next section I'll just talk about is alternative Medicaid expansion options that were approved in other states. Essentially, when you talk about, when I say alternative Medicaid expansion, I basically mean you're expanding through a waiver. So as we talked about, there are 32 states that have expanded. 24 states have basically done it through the state plan amendment. And like I said, the state plan is what governs every state's Medicaid program. It is, you can think of it more as the traditional Medicaid program, and 24 states have used that method. And then 8 states have used what they call the 1115 waiver. It's a demonstration waiver. It lets you waive some of the rules of Medicaid and modify the program to do it in different ways. And 8 states have used that method simply, to some degree because that's what worked for that state. That's how they were willing to proceed. So why would you want to necessarily do it through a waiver? Well, in those 8 states, it's oftentimes because they believe that they want Medicaid to look more like commercial insurance, because Medicaid is very different than commercial insurance. It's much more unique, as well as kind of increase the personal responsibility of individuals and promote healthy behaviors and those sorts of things that you might be able to do that more through a waiver, as well as control costs. Certainly, there are things that you could probably do under a waiver to better control those costs, and certainly these states believe that they could do that. This map just shows you the 8 states that have done it as an alternative. Those are Arizona, Montana, Iowa, Arkansas, Kentucky, Indiana, Michigan, and New Hampshire. When Medicaid expansion first occurred, Pennsylvania actually did do a waiver, but when they changed administrations in their state, they actually switched back to a state plan. So states could actually move back and forth as it suits that state. And actually, I already covered this slide in the previous presentation. It was just the summary of the governor, House, and Senate proposals from all those budgets. So I won't go over that again, but it's just there for your reference. So in looking at these other states, talking about elements of alternative Medicaid expansion, certainly in a waiver, you have a lot of discretion. You can do a lot. It's pretty wide open. Pretty much, you could say that you could just ask and let the feds say no. So in lots of states are actually trying to do new things, and of course, CMS is actually starting to say no to certain things. The most recent one being is pursuing lifetime benefits for Medicaid. CMS has said that no, they do not believe that is appropriate. So what do these other states do? Well, cost sharing is a big one. 7 of the 8 states are all requiring premium payments. Oftentimes, typically they're like 2% of your income, because there are federal limits to how much of individuals' income can actually contribute to cost sharing. And so they might use a sliding scale. You have 5 states who actually disenroll individuals for failure to pay. So just because you charge a premium doesn't mean you have to disenroll people. But there are some states that will disenroll you for doing that. And some have lockout periods as well, which basically means if you didn't pay your premium, we disenroll you and you can't come back for like a year or whatever the lockout period is. Indiana actually was approved. In their premiums, they charge a surcharge for tobacco users. They were the first state to request and receive that. There's also a state, one state actually charges higher co-payments for non-emergency use of the ER to try to discourage the use of ER. So CMS did actually approve that for one state. So when you look at coverage effective date, what this means is it's actually retroactive eligibility. And if you don't know what that really is in Medicaid, it's the way Medicaid works is if you enroll in Medicaid and you would have been eligible for the 90 days prior to applying, then it will cover any healthcare costs that occurred in that 90 days prior to application. And 5 states have actually requested for their expansion populations to waive that retroactive eligibility, so costs will only be covered from the day that they apply or enroll. 2 states, Indiana and Michigan, have used kind of a form of a health savings account. It's not a true health savings account, but it's similar to those. And like in Indiana, it's kind of used to help them meet cost sharing requirements. There's now a 4th state. New Hampshire was recently approved for the work requirement. So 4 states now have a work requirement. They all do it a little bit differently. But typically, they're all requiring that able-bodied adults must work a certain number of hours either per week, 20 hours per week, or 80 hours per month. And then, of course, they have to define kind of what qualifies as work, who's eligible, what are the exceptions for those people where work may not be as appropriate. You also see that there's some, one state actually has kind of a grace period of like 6 months before you have to meet the work requirement. And then I know at least one state actually requires frequent demonstrations of compliance. I believe it's Arizona. They want to make sure you're compliant every month. Of course, the caution with that is to verify something like that frequently just adds to your cost. But for some states, that's kind of what they are interested in doing. Two states related to eligibility determinations have actually received approval that if you do not do what you're supposed to do after a year, every year you're supposed to renew your eligibility, which is basically you usually get a letter, says you got to provide whatever documents, whatever information to make sure you're eligible. But two states have said, well, if you don't do what you're supposed to do, then we're going to disenroll you, and then of course you have to re-enroll at some later date. It's
Mr.
kind of
Chairman?
trying to reduce the issue of churn.
Mike, Senator Wagner?
On the work requirement, has any of the states used their employment commissions who routinely checks to ensure that people are either looking for work or getting a job training in order to get their eligibility or get their unemployment check?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Wagner, I'll have to look into that. I can do that.
Okay, thanks.
Mr. Chairman, Mike, while you're looking into that, can you also get us some of the cost estimates for states that, if they have done that through one of the existing agencies, what's the cost on that verification?
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, down this.
Senator Obenshain?
I noticed that you mentioned that the House plan had a provision in it by which somebody would be disqualified from receiving Medicaid if they had 3 months where they didn't comply with the work requirement. I'm curious, does the House plan have any means of checking compliance and enforcing that?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Obenshain, I think it's really more left to the administration to figure out how you work out these details. Because what it basically does, and that provision, which is called the lockout provision, is similar to Kentucky in the sense that if you do not qualify for 3 months out of the 12-month period, then you would be locked out for the next plan year. So, offhand, I think it's kind of in the details of how you would implement it.
Further question, does it include money for enforcement?
Well, yes. Yeah, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of like 20 to 25 million per year.
That's in there?
Yeah, it's kind of, I didn't want to get into too much detail, but if you look at the House plan actually assumes expansion doesn't occur October 1, but occurs January 1. So your savings were reduced. But if you actually looked at the numbers, the costs were not reduced because they just took the difference and said, well, that's what they're going to use to enforce the provisions of essentially their TIOP, the work requirement program.
Okay. All right.
And last, I just touched base, kind of benefits and healthy behavior incentives. So some of the states, there are 3 states.
Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry, I was
Yes, Senator
slow to the draw. Once again, bear with me, Mike, but my understanding was this was coverage for the working poor, and these are folks who are already working, but they can't earn above the threshold. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Stewart, I mean, if you mean they can't, you mean above like the 138%?
The 138% of
correct.
poverty.
Once they reach that, then they would lose their coverage.
Mr. Chairman? So if they're at the 138% of poverty and they qualify, are these people who are working 40 hours a week but at a wage that they can't get above the poverty level? And so then does the requirement that the House has put in require them to work beyond that or just to work at all?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Stewart, the requirement is just to work at all, at least basically about 20 hours per week or 80 hours per month, essentially is what the requirement is. It has nothing to do with income. There is the thought that you could actually just do as a way to verify work, you could just do an earnings test, that if you make so much money, you have to be working, based upon minimum wage and 20 hours per week. At this level of earnings, you would have to be working in order to do that as a way to kind of verify it in a different way. But yes, if you reach the income level.
So, Mr. Chairman.
Sir Stewart?
So then this really is not necessarily for what this is being billed as for working poor people who, this is just for people who are below or at that threshold of 138% of poverty, and now the House would say you got to work at least 20 hours a week to get this health care.
Mr. Chairman, Senator, well, if you want to use the term the working poor, I think what you'll find is, and what the data shows, is that most of these people are working. So if
Right.
you want to refer to it as the
Well, that's
working
what I
poor.
thought, that-
And
but they
most of them
couldn't-
will already meet the work requirements. And I'd have to go back and pull the numbers because JLARC did a lot of the work on the estimates for how many were not working. But it was in the tens of thousands of people, not hundreds. So most of them are working and would technically meet that requirement when they enroll.
So, Mr. Chairman, are you done?
Yeah, I'm finished.
Done? Okay, Senator Carrico?
So can you give us an example of that 138% for Virginia? Is it, if I'm single and childless, is that 12,000? 15? 16,000? If I'm married and have children? 2 children?
Senator Carrico, well, you're challenging me a little bit now because I didn't bring those numbers with me. But
Well, give me a
it's-
ballpark.
Well, I mean, I think once you get to
30.
yeah, it's probably the 30 to 35,000 range if you're talking more about a family of
30 to 35.
yeah. It might be a little bit higher for a family of 4.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Okay, Mike?
Okay, Mr. Chairman, thank you. So just to conclude, this slide was, like I said, there are, when you think about Medicaid benefits, there are 3 states that actually asked and received approval to eliminate non-emergency transportation. So that's where Medicaid, it's actually a required benefit, is that you have to provide transportation to take people to the doctor and that sort of stuff. And several states have had it waived for the expansion of population. 6 states have also received approval to promote healthy behaviors in different ways. Oftentimes what they do it is they'll say, we'll reduce your premium or cost-sharing requirements if you do things like complete a health risk assessment or annual wellness exam, or maybe like have a smoking cessation, be part of a smoking cessation program or something like that. So anyway, so that's just kind of examples of you can do a lot through a waiver, but it still requires negotiation and approval by the federal government. So as we talked earlier, and I actually said I would kind of come back to this. So you talk about, I think, Senator Stewart had talked a lot about capping enrollment and controlling like that. What I included here in this slide is just the idea of, what do other states kind of do? I don't know if I'd use the term cap, even though you actually see that one I talk about is New York. New York actually refers to it as a cap. But so these are just some of the states that, as I've done research, have kind of come across different things that they do to try to better control Medicaid spending. And there's kind of two ways here. There's sort of like 2 of them are like, if you talk about Medicaid, are more specific and direct to Medicaid and trying to control Medicaid costs. And 2 other ones are actually more directed at actually trying to control general health care costs, which indirectly would benefit Medicaid if you reduce those health care costs. It would show up in Medicaid as well. So when you look at more direct Medicaid ones, you have there's New York. So New York actually has what they call a global spending cap. When Governor Cuomo came in back in 2011, New York has one of the most expensive Medicaid programs in the nation. So certainly it puts a lot of pressure even on that state, and he wanted to do a lot of reforms and redesign Medicaid. One of the things that came out of this was this idea of a global spending cap. And in New York, it's actually tied to the 10-year rolling average of medical inflation, which roughly right now would be about 3.8%, which is a fairly low rate for Medicaid. Granted, in New York's case, with such a generous program, they would probably have a lot greater capacity to try to stay within that cap than other states that might be more frugal. Then there's also another example, Ohio's per capita limit. So in Ohio, Governor Kasich, a few years ago, he apparently had the administrative authority to expand Medicaid on his own. He did. The General Assembly there kind of pushed back, and what they got out of this was this thing called the Medicaid Oversight Commission, and what they actually have the power to do under the law is to establish the per enrollee limit, sort of like the per capita limit that Medicaid can grow. It's never been enforced yet. They said it. They haven't really hit it. They've only been doing it for like 2 years, but it was kind of a different way. And Ohio is sort of kind of like focused on, if you remember what Congress was looking at a lot of actions, they were sort of looking at like a per capita or per enrollee cost cap. Of course, they were only trying to cap their share of Medicaid, not the state share. So it wouldn't necessarily help us if they necessarily did it. So then when you look at healthcare cost control, well, Massachusetts created the Health Policy Commission in 2012. This actually all stems from the fact, if you go all the way back to the idea of Romney Care, when they kind of expanded health insurance in Massachusetts. Massachusetts had the highest healthcare costs in the nation. And so ultimately what their state did is create this health policy commission that's focused on bringing a lot of transparency and understanding what drives healthcare costs and trying to come up with the solutions to try to address them. But as part of that, they've also developed this, what they call their healthcare cost growth benchmark. So they're actually looking at healthcare costs across the state, the entire sector, and trying to stay within it. And my understanding is that they've only done this for 4 years. In the last, out of those 4, 2 times, they were able to stay within it. But again, they're trying to address the broader healthcare cost issue. And then just a very different one is Maryland actually has, and they've done this since the 1970s, is all-payer hospital rate setting. The state of Maryland actually sets the rates that all hospitals are paid for all payers, including Medicare, which is a federal program. It's a very different way to do it. Maryland has just done it because they've done it for decades anyway. But technically, to the degree that they control that aspect of healthcare costs, certainly can translate to other payers, including Medicaid. So those are just examples of what you can do. I know there's talking about like capping enrollment. I don't think you can cap enrollment. I don't think the feds would ever approve that itself, just because they still see it as, a program that is an entitlement, and you can't cap enrollment. But it doesn't mean that, like these other states are trying to basically, I think, create a framework to try to get greater accountability in Medicaid spending.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Stewart?
So, Mike, obviously, this is directly to my point. So when you talk about New York's spending cap, can you say we're not going to let Medicaid, period, expansion and all the existing programs exceed 10% of the state budget? Can you do that and get away with it, or?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Stewart, at the end of the day, it's an entitlement. So you're not going to not pay somebody's healthcare bills. That's why I said you have to think of it differently, because no, they're not going to let you just say, oh, you're out of money, that's done. Because pretty much then it's going to be the providers who aren't getting paid, and of course you're going to hear from them. So no, I mean, you still have to recognize that it has an entitlement nature. I think what these other states are attempting to do, and the way that you would look at it is, again, is you're trying to create a process and a framework to say, all right, let's say, for example, you want to say, we don't want over a period of time Medicaid to exceed the average growth rate of the general fund. And let's just say that growth rate was 4%. So then the question becomes, how do you stay within 4%? That requires the state to look at everything that's driving Medicaid, from not just provider rates, but the benefits they provide, limits on services and how they do those things, as well as exactly who is enrolled, even though Virginia doesn't have a lot of optional enrollment. To look at all those things, but also to look at other innovations that might drive healthcare spending down. So it's the idea of it creates a greater focus on what is driving Medicaid and what the state can actually do to try to control those costs. At the end of the day, if you exceed it, you're not going to just be able to cut off the funding, but at least you could say that you might have actually reduced it more than it otherwise would have grown.
So, Mr. Chairman, the simple answer to my question in the very beginning is there's just no way to control how big this program grows. If it's expanded, there's no way to control its growth.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Stewart, I'm an analyst, so I don't deal with simple answers.
That's probably not for you. Senator Stewart, I would answer for you. I don't think you can put a hard cap on it, but you can manage it, and that's what we would have to do.
Mr. Chair.
Is manage it.
Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair.
Senator Barker?
I don't know whether this is a leading question or not, but someone else could make that judgment. But do we not already, in effect, manage this in a lot of different ways? I mean, we've been very aggressive in Virginia in terms of having managed care programs involved, so that it's not just DMAS writing checks when somebody gets a medical service. We provided incentives on part of some of the programs we're doing now for services to the elderly, et cetera, so that they're building incentives to try to reduce utilization there. We have put limitations in terms of what we will pay, who we will pay for nursing home care. which has helped us achieve a very low use rate of nursing home beds for the elderly compared to other states around the country. We don't pay what it costs. For nursing homes, I think we're paying about 92% of cost. For physicians, about 75% of what Medicare pays. For hospitals, it's about 70% of their cost. So all these things are things that we do to try to manage the expenditures and to try to manage the utilization of services that allows us, I think, to, and we frequently are recognized in a lot of different ways, for the efficiency of our Medicaid program as a result of that. So aren't we already doing things to be able to manage things, to hold down the state expenditures and to hold down utilization?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Barker, yes, this is not a commentary on all the reforms that Virginia has done. Certainly, we continue to push along with managed care. Right. Certainly, Virginia has been very successful in like you talked about, with caring for elderly individuals in the home as opposed to nursing homes. There are a lot of things that that Virginia has done well, and certainly, I think the question here is there more that the state could do to, in a sense, almost like set a target that you want to achieve, and then increase your focus and your monitoring, and try to drive greater accountability, even more so than we have today? I think maybe that's part of the question is, can we as a state do even more and find other aspects of the program or the next iteration of those innovations to try to drive down costs? So it really just depends on how you approach it. But I think everyone wants to make sure that healthcare costs are reasonable, and I think part of a lot of that has to do with making sure that the program and how it spends it is fully accountable. So that when you all ask me the question like, well, what did we get for this, or what did we achieve? Y'all don't want to hear me say that it's complicated. It's like you expect me to give you an answer. So yep. So maybe it's just the idea of having more of a target that the state tries to reach, and it just creates that process and framework and maybe it's just the constant vigilance to keep looking at it to try to achieve it.
Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Senator McDougall.
Mike, on this chart, I'm going back to page 9 that you had that shows our projected share of the general fund budget is moving from a little over 22% now to about 28% in 2028, so 10 years. Is that with all those managed items that Senator Barker was just articulating?
Mr. Chairman, Senator McDougall, I mean, that's an illustration. I mean, like I said, it reflects technically decades of growth have reached Virginia to be at 22%. This is just making the assumptions that if the Medicaid continues to grow 3% faster than the general fund growth, this is what you get.
Mr. Chairman, 10 years ago, it was about 16% of our general fund budget, and now we're close to 23%.
Mr. Chairman, Senator McDougall, I don't have the numbers right with me, but
right.
That's probably accurate.
Okay.
Right.
And does that include those reforms that we were just talking about, those management items that we've tried to put in place?
Mr. Chairman, Senator McDougall, certainly in that period, there were lots of reforms and stuff like that. I think we're still, a lot of the managed care stuff has occurred more in recent years, and it would take a few years before you start to reap the benefits of that anyway. But yes, there are many reforms in there.
Mr. Chairman,
and there are many more on the way.
Mike, could you extend back this graph you have on page 9 to include the last 10 years so we can see where we came from, what occurred over the last 10 years, and we can put it juxtaposed to where we're going over the next 10 years?
I think that would be good. Also, I think we ought to focus, though, on the last probably 4 to 5 years as we've gone through a whole series of Medicaid reforms beginning in 2014. Yeah. Okay. All right. Probably need to speed up a little bit. We've got a couple of members that need to talk about their amendments.
So everything else is easy, Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
So the next one, just a quick assessment of the provider assessment. And this is just, like I said, it's informational. Like I said, I talked about the $307 million with the cost of expansion, the introduced budget, as well as the House proposed to basically, what it is it's an assessment against the net patient revenue of a hospital. It's focused really on acute private hospitals, but it's estimated to be about 0.5% of that net patient revenue in FY19 and then 1.4% in FY20. That revenue would be deposited to the healthcare fund. That, of course, the healthcare fund is used to fund the state share of Medicaid. It excludes public hospitals. You can see a variety of more specialty hospitals are all excluded in critical access hospitals. And lastly, I just talk about, like, when you kind of talk about are there advantages and disadvantages to a provider assessment, certainly some of the advantages, of course, is it eliminates the additional burden on the general fund. One can certainly make the argument that providing additional resource could better protect the AAA bond rating, as well as it frees up the Medicaid expansion savings that technically have been used in other budget areas. So those are certainly some of the advantages that you could look at from it. Then disadvantages, of course, well, what does it do? You're assessing them. The hospitals otherwise receive a benefit of additional revenue from the expansion population, but now you're taking a part of it. So you're reducing that benefit to hospitals. And lastly, the impact actually varies by hospital. So certainly the benefits of how much you get assessed from the hospital assessment versus what revenue you get from expanding certainly varies by hospital. A small rural hospital may not benefit as much from expansion in a provider assessment scenario than other hospitals. And so that's why, to give you a little bit of an idea of the impact on hospitals, and this is actually information that comes from the Department of Medical Assistance Services. And so it's looking at 1 year, fiscal year 2020, and it shows that the private acute hospitals that will pay the assessment would be projected to receive about $550 million in new revenue. The assessment they would pay is about $237 million in that year. So the net fiscal impact is $312 million. But then I broke it out by the urban versus rural hospitals. The rural, it encompasses maybe about 15 hospitals are technically considered rural. And you can see that, they just don't have nearly the revenue. And of course, the assessment, this shows the net benefit. However, there is one major caveat of this chart, and I don't have good information myself to show this, is that, and this is actually footnoted, is when you expand Medicaid, DMAS estimates that there are about 60,000 people in the federal marketplace between 100 and 138% of poverty. They will qualify for Medicaid and they'll shift to Medicaid. So the hospitals will lose that commercial revenue as it transitions over to Medicaid revenue. That's not really factored in here. So technically, the fiscal impact on them would actually be lessened. And I also had the numbers there for UV and VCU, although I do want to caveat that for the teaching hospitals. Technically, their money, their new expansion revenue is really, for the most part, offsetting their indigent care payments that the state makes to them now. So they're not necessarily a huge beneficiary from expansion because the state already gives them a lot to cover their indigent care costs. So I did just want to kind of note that there is this population that moves from commercial insurance into Medicaid that occurs there. And that's part of the reason why you all know that the Hospital Association has advocated for kind of increasing, while we're doing a provider assessment, to actually increase that provider assessment more, to up to 88% of cost, to provide more revenue to the hospitals and offset some of their costs. And one reason, of course, is this would be better for some of those rural hospitals that maybe aren't as, where the provider assessment with Medicaid expansion isn't as advantageous as for other hospitals. And you can see the current reimbursement rates for inpatient is about 71%. The state share, of course, would be paid through a provider assessment. So this would be on top of the $307 million that they're supposed to pay over the biennium, that they would pay the additional state share to draw down the federal dollars to receive this enhanced reimbursement. And I just noted at the bottom how much that new revenue would equate to, about $127 million in the first year and $157 million in the second year. So at the very end, I'll just kind of cap. So we went through the session. The Senate was very much interested in affordability in the individual health insurance market. And this is mainly in response to the fact that for the 2018 plan year, the rate increases were from a range of 35 to 81%. The Senate advanced a variety of bills to try to address some of the options to make that health insurance more affordable this session, such things like a Senate Bill 672 that redefined a small employer to include self-employed individuals, Senate Bill 844 focused on short-term insurance policies, as well as Senate Bill 934, 935 that deal with association health plans. And short-term policies and association health plans are something that the federal government is changing regulations to try to promote them as well. And lastly, Senate Bill 964 was requesting a federal waiver. This was a Section 1332 waiver specific to trying to make catastrophic plans, which are offered in the exchange. They're technically cheaper than the other plans, to make them available to everyone that's on the exchange, to give them another alternative. Except for Senate Bill 672, all the other bills, the governor had offered amendments, so they are actually still pending his final signature, which would be by the end of this week, or his final action. And lastly, when you talk about options, well, there's 2 more slides. Options for affordability in the individual market. So a lot that y'all are aware of is talking about the reinsurance program. It's the idea 3 other states have done this to a Section 1332 waiver. And the House, of course, in House Bill 5002 is proposed to look at this as well. So the state could request it, and the way it basically works is if you implement a reinsurance program, you're basically covering the high portion of the highest cost claims of individuals, reducing the overall financial exposure of those insurance companies, thereby reducing premium cost. That, of course, since the federal government pays premium subsidies, they save money. They would actually give that savings to the state to fund the program. There would be a state share, but in order to figure out all the numbers here, you would actually have to conduct an actuarial analysis to figure out what are the program costs to achieve a certain level of reduction. But some states have actually, at least one, reduced premiums by about as much as 20% through it. Another state was like 7%. So it really depends on how much you want to achieve and how much the program would cost. There's kind of another proposal out there too, that the idea of on the individual market, that the state could basically try to set the rates to the Medicaid fee schedule. Certainly commercial rates are much higher than Medicaid rates. So that would put certainly a dramatic downward pressure on health insurer costs, and could potentially reduce premiums even greater than a reinsurance program. Of course, providers, they're not really going to like that, mainly because, of course, they get a lower rate. Not to mention the fact, too, it also deals with the idea of, the individual market is a private sector market, and so those rates are voluntarily agreed to between the plans and the providers. So certainly that route is there's a lot more, it's much more complicated, whereas a reinsurance program is something being tried by other states as well. And then very lastly, just a quick update on the individual. You probably saw it in the news recently. At the very beginning of May, the initial filings for the 2019 plan year were submitted. The average rate changes ranges from as low as a negative 1.9%, which is Optima, to as high as 64.3%. I did just note, since Anthem is one of the larger companies in that market, that their average change is estimated to be about 5.6% increase. There's one new entrant, as you probably saw in the papers as well. Virginia Premier is actually going to enter the Richmond market because there was only one carrier, Cigna, in that market, and they plan to enter that market for 2019 as well. So with that, Mr. Chairman, that concludes my presentation.
Okay, Mike, you took quite a bit of time.
Mr. Chairman.
We contributed to that, though, didn't we? Yeah.
Yes, you did, Mr. Chairman.
Senator McDougall?
Mike, can you tell me how, I don't think I saw it in your presentation, how does the House cut off, if the federal government decides not to continue the match, how do they cut off being in the program? Because my understanding, some states like Arkansas tried to back out or reduce and have not yet been able to do it. So what mechanism is in the budget bill before us that allows that to occur? And do the feds permit it?
Mr. Chairman, Sir McDougall, the language that's in the bill is actually language that has been, every time it's been proposed over the last few years, has been there, which basically says that if the federal government reduces essentially their contribution for the expansion population, then you could go and proceed to disenroll it. The feds have said in the past that, yes, you can do this, but yes, if you get beyond the political issue of disenrolling hundreds of thousands of people, then you're talking about the mechanics of it. Certainly, you would have to provide notice. You would have to, you may even have to see if they're eligible for some other category in Medicaid to maintain their eligibility. you may have to give them the opportunity to appeal if they think they're eligible in some other category. So there certainly can be processes that affect that disenrollment process. But I mean, the feds have indicated that you can do it. Whether a state ever would is certainly a different question.
Senator McDougal.
So, under your understanding of the process, even if you can do it, it is a process that would at least at a minimum take multiple months, if not multiple years to go through if somebody had appellate rights and you had to provide them other types of services.
Mr. Chairman, Senator McDougal, oh yeah, I mean, it would easily, I mean, I'd have to go back and look to see what it is. I mean, the notice alone to the recipient is probably at least 3 months would be my guess. But yeah, if they go through other processes, I mean, you can't turn it off in a switch. It's a huge
Thank you,
program.
Mr.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, just to follow up on Senator McDougal's questions there, Arkansas had a provision where I think they had to renew take a legislative action to renew it, and under their provisions, they had to get 3/4 vote in both the House and the Senate to do that. And it was questionable whether they would get that. In the end, they did get that, so they have kept the program operating.
Okay. All right. Senator Norman?
Mike, if I could ask you to wander down the mythical and blasphemous path of Never Never Land with 2 questions. Could Virginia impose a rate freeze on hospital healthcare providers and/or insurers?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Norman, I'm not a lawyer, but
Well, tell me what you think.
I don't see why the state couldn't.
All right. My second question is there anything that would preclude the General Assembly from considering placing a tax on health care insurers?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Norman, no.
Okay.
Okay. All right. We've got quite a bit of work left, obviously, on this subject, and a lot of good questions have been raised today as we continue this conversation. Anybody else have a question? We're going to. Okay. Thank you, Mike. Appreciate that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, we've had some patient patrons, and I think what we'll do,
Mr. Chairman.
we still have some more information?
No, Mr. Chairman, if you will recall, you sent out a letter to all 40 members.
That's
on
what I'm
May the
talking about
3rd.
now. I got you under control.
Okay.
Actually, I don't want to walk through all of them. What I want to do is go down the list right now, if we can.
It is behind tab 4.
What's that? Okay, good. And because we have several members here who are not members of the Finance Committee that I'd like to have an opportunity if they want to speak to their individual amendments. And I see about 4 of them sitting here. And I think what we'll do then is just allow them a couple moments to come forward and speak to their, Senator DeStaff has one. Do you want to speak to yours?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I believe I have 3, actually.
Okay.
One of them is on, and I'm going to go off my memory on this since I don't have anything in front of me.
We have, actually, we've got a list there. If you want to let him borrow your list. On the first page, item number 4.
First one, item number 4. What that is for a juvenile domestic and relations district court. And in Virginia Beach, the way we account for our cases, since we have so many military cases, we actually don't count them in with the normal count the way other jurisdictions do it. So on the JDC side, we have a requirement for a judge, but it falls just under that, like 1 under. Senator Obenchain, Senator Wagner, and I discussed this, but it was a little late in the process when it was pointed out to me. So I put in that for the juvenile domestic and relations court judge. The second one, which was the Tidewater building, it's under, I think it's number 18.
18 on page 3.
Under the Building Trades Academy pilot program. Well, the Building Trades Academy was the longest serving building trades academy in the state, and they shut it this year. So that $50,000, there's no need for the $50,000 in the budget. So I was
Okay.
asking that we eliminate that. And then on page 5, I had item 3631S, a bike facility at First Landing, which was putting $50,000 in there to lay out a mountain bike trail in the most populated park in the state, which would be the First Landing State Park. And I
Okay.
thought that would be a wonderful opportunity to take the $50,000 we're cutting in one place and put it in another.
I like that one.
So those are the 3 different things I have.
All right. Thank you, Senator
Thank you for
DeSteffe.
your time.
Okay, Senator Reeves? And I might add, we will have action tomorrow. We'll go through the whole list of, by the committee or subcommittees and make recommendations hopefully during the course of our deliberations tomorrow. You have.
Thank you, Mr.
number-
Chairman. I have on page 1.
Page 1.
It's number 6. It has the Solar Energy Power Reclamation Bond, Performance and Reclamation Bond. Mr. Chairman, or Mr. Chairman, plural, this came about as a result of a solar generation plant that's going to be about 6,350 acres up in the district. And there's been a lot of concern and consternation about the environmental impact of something that's going to take place, which we won't see what the impact will be till 35 years when it's done. In some of the homework that we've done, we found that there really wasn't a state-level oversight on this. What this line amendment's trying to do is set up a process where solar power plants assume that they have to have a performance and reclamation bond in place. This current plan is going to be about 500 megawatts. This is huge. So what it does is manage the true risk associated with the solar development of this magnitude. But it does have a little clause in there that if localities, similar guarantees or instruments are required by local governments or other permitting entities for environmental liabilities, the Commonwealth shall be listed as a named additional insured on those policies, on the bonds, excuse me. The second budget amendment I have would be on page 4, item number 25, 307, number 2S, improving accountability in Medicaid spending. And, Mr. Chairman, it's pretty self-explanatory. I think it's been touched on. Mike Tweedy talked about it a little bit. It takes some of Mike's ideas and put them into effect, where it establishes a spending target for the Medicaid program to increase monitoring, transparency, and accountability over Medicaid spending if we go that direction. And lastly, Mr. Chairman, on page 5, number 30, line 385, number 1S, having the forethought to think we're going down this road, if there are additional monies, I would still like to help my distillers out. I know it's in the red parentheses, but it would take that 6% and take it to 15% commission. And I thank the committee's time.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Reeves, for hanging around as well for those 3 items. And we will be taking those up tomorrow. Senator Eben. I think Senator Mason was ahead of you on the list, but I believe he left now. Senator Eben, I guess you're up next.
Yeah, he asked me to take his time. No, in the interest of time, I've got 2. I'm not going to discuss the one about the Virginia Preschool Initiative. It's there for your consideration. But I did want to discuss the Alexandria CSO funding. You may remember that there was $20 million in former governor's introduced budget to do some bonds from the Virginia Public Building Authority, but it was taken out of the budget. And I wanted to let you know, since the session has ended, that the city of Alexandria has approved a plan to construct a tunnel system to bring combined sewer flows to our water quality plant. And the city has approved a 25% increase in sewer fees, and the rates will increase exponentially over the next 8 years, no matter what we do today. However, as you know, Richmond has gotten about $100 million over the last 33 years for their project, Lynchburg over $200 million since the 80s. Now, the reason I think it's important we get this started now is we've mandated that Alexandria get this done in 5 years. So it's going to cost the city about $385 million, but the estimate could increase by as much as $178 million because of the 5-year time frame. That's really unknown whether it could go that high. So because we're spending $80 million over the next 2 years, that's $80 million, we're asking the state, rather than giving the full $20 million that was in the budget, to consider in a revenue neutral way just $10 million. And the revenue neutral way to do that would be to take 10 million from the Stormwater Local Assistance Fund, which is currently allocated, and move 10 of those $20 million in the second year to aid for that CSO. And I've got more info. I don't know that you have questions, but I wanted to bring it to your attention, and it's a revenue-neutral way to do that. The Commonwealth has really been a financial partner to those other localities, and we're asking for some help.
Okay. All right, any questions on that? We need to follow up, I guess, as far as the timing issue on this a bit, but we will explore that.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right, were there any other non-members that we didn't outweight? That was the strategy, I guess, wasn't it? Okay. All right, April, Jason, had y'all anticipated anything additional on that list, or we just go through them tomorrow? What?
No, Mr. Chairman, other than the window was open for 20 hours, approximately 20 business hours, including a weekend, and you got 36 requests from 16 members, which means the letter did not get out to the lobbyists, because we normally get about 450 requests. Thank you, Chris. Thank you very much. That was all.
They were probably lost in the mail. April?
I just wanted to clarify, Mr. Chairman, Senator Norman's earlier question. I wanted to state that those numbers that I gave out were from the consultant that Secretary Lane referenced, so not my own calculations, but also as far as the basis points, their estimates on the basis points, depending on whether there was an action to downgrade Virginia, were between 7 and 15. So I just wanted to close the loop. Thank you.
Okay. Logistical questions then. Our meeting place, is it right here tomorrow?
We have reserved the room for the full committee at 9:30, though if you wanted to do the subcommittee, as you mentioned, the room is already reserved.
What we anticipate doing, and we'll just have a little conversation about that right now, is rather than the full committee meeting at 9:30, we want to allow at least some point during the day the subcommittees, as the chairs would find appropriate or needed, to have some time to meet. So at 9:30, we would propose, Senator Norman and I would propose that the HHR subcommittee would meet. And then at 10:30, the full committee would meet. So then the subcommittee chairs, if you want to find a convenient time or sidebar conversations or whatever, particularly addressing the member amendments that are on the sheets that staff has prepared for us, so that you might be able to have some commentary when we get around to the point of addressing these. That would be the basic beginning plan. And I would say we'll probably have, several hours of work for us ourselves tomorrow. Okay, any further questions or comments then? So HHR committee, I'll be here at 9:30, everybody else 10:30. And I declare the meeting adjourned.